The evening of February 24th, 1942, draped itself over Los Angeles with a deceptive calm. For a city perched on the edge of a vast, dark ocean, nights often carried a certain quiet rhythm. The sigh of the Pacific breeze through palm fronds, the distant, mournful call of a foghorn, the soft glow of streetlights painting amber pools on empty sidewalks. Just 3 months after the shock of Pearl Harbor, a palpable tension hummed beneath the surface of daily life, a collective holding of breath. Yet, on this particular Tuesday, as the sun dipped behind the Santa Monica Mountains, a semblance of ordinary peace settled in. Families gathered around radio consoles in living rooms warmed by furnace heat, the voices of Fibber McGee and Molly, or the strains of a big band broadcast providing a comforting soundtrack against the worries of the world. In bedrooms, children were read stories, their windows cracked open to let in the cool, clean February air, carrying the faint, salty scent of the sea from beaches now darkened under blackout regulations. Outside, the city itself seemed to be resting, gathering its strength. The usual relentless glitter of Hollywood was subdued, veiled in compliance with air defense directives. This allowed, for those who stepped outside to gaze upward, a rare spectacle. Beyond the muted halo of the city, the night sky unveiled a breathtaking tapestry of stars. Constellations like Orion stood with timeless clarity, and the winter Milky Way stretched as a faint, dusty river across the expanse. It was a view that spoke of eternity, a reminder of a universe far removed from the fleeting conflicts of mankind. People looked up and felt small, perhaps, but also connected to something immense and peaceful. On quiet porches and in modest backyards, couples talked in hushed tones about ration books and victory gardens, their breath forming soft clouds in the chill, their ears attuned to the comforting, familiar sounds of their neighborhood, a dog barking blocks away, the gentle rustle of eucalyptus leaves. This fragile tranquility was woven with threads of quiet anxiety. Civil defense posters reminded citizens to be vigilant. Volunteer plane spotters took shifts on rooftops, scanning the horizons with determination. Every car headlight painted with half-black paint was a reminder. Every practiced air raid drill in schools and workplaces underlined the new reality. The war was not a distant headline, but a presence, a ghost at the feast of normal life. People went through their evening rituals with a subtle hyper-awareness, the music on the radio a conscious effort to soothe jangled nerves. They checked their blackout curtains one more time, ensuring not a sliver of light could betray their home to a hypothetical enemy high above. The ocean, once a symbol of endless possibility, now felt like a vast, dark doorway from which anything could emerge. Into this potent mix of stellar beauty and human unease, at precisely 2:25 a.m. on the 25th, the silence was torn apart. It began not with a sight, but with a sound that froze blood and stopped hearts mid-beat. The wail of air raid sirens, eerie and relentless, erupted across the basin. It climbed from a low moan to a piercing, oscillating shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the hillsides and flooding the canyons. In an instant, the serene night was vacuumed away. Radios clicked off mid-sentence. Sleep vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. Families stumbled from beds in the sudden, mandatory darkness, fumbling for robes and children. Hearts pounded against ribs as the citywide scream continued, its message terrifyingly clear. The threat was no longer theoretical. The war had found its way to the City of Angels. But what they were about to witness would defy every explanation the military could offer, transforming a night of fear into a permanent, luminous mystery hanging over the California coast. The sirens were a call to action, a trigger for practice drills, but what followed was a descent into profound confusion. Across the sprawling, darkened city, thousands of citizens, now volunteer sentinels in their own right, pressed their faces against blackout curtains, or stepped cautiously into backyards, their eyes straining against the moonless sky. What they reported seeing was not a formation of enemy bombers, but something that defied immediate understanding. From Santa Monica to Long Beach, from the Hollywood Hills down to the harbor in San Pedro, the calls began flooding switchboards, not with panic, but with bewildered questions. A night watchman in Culver City, patrolling a locked film studio lot, was the first to report it to his local air raid warden. A single, glowing amber light, moving with a slow, drifting pace high over the ocean. It made no sound. It did not blink like an aircraft. It simply hung, a distant, untethered star that seemed to pulse with a faint, internal radiance. Volunteer plane spotters, stationed on rooftops and hills with binoculars and logbooks, were among the first to note the anomalies. These were trained observers, people who could identify silhouettes of friendly and enemy aircraft. Their initial reports, crackling over field telephones, spoke of objects that didn't match any known profile. One spotter in Inglewood described a cluster of lights, like a loose constellation that had broken free, moving in an erratic, zigzag pattern against the prevailing wind. Another, near the Douglas aircraft plant, swore he saw a vast, dark shape, like a batwing, blotting out stars as it passed silently overhead. The emotional responses were a tangled web. For some, the dominant feeling was a cold, gripping fear. This was the invasion they had dreaded since December. For others, particularly those farther from the coast, a strange sense of wonder crept in. The lights were beautiful, almost hypnotic in their silent glide, an otherworldly spectacle unfolding above their own homes. Simultaneously, the city's civil defense skeleton snapped into action with grim efficiency. Air raid wardens, identifiable by their white helmets and armbands, emerged from their homes, scanning the skies as they hurried to their posts. The citywide blackout order, a terrifying but rehearsed maneuver, was executed. Streetlights died. The few cars on the roads pulled over, their masked headlights extinguished. Every window in Los Angeles, from the grand estates of Pasadena to the bungalows of Boyle Heights, went dark as citizens meticulously checked their curtains. The metropolis of over 1 million people vanished into an inky pool, a collective holding of breath beneath the stars. This enforced darkness, however, only made the celestial phenomena more starkly visible. The strange lights were now the brightest objects in the heavens. The central, terrifying question began to solidify in every mind. Was this the long-feared Japanese attack? The West Coast had been bracing for airstrikes or even invasion. Yet, these sightings contradicted that narrative. Witnesses noted the objects would sometimes stop dead in the air, hover motionless for minutes, then accelerate away at impossible speeds. They moved against the wind, performed sharp, 90-degree turns that would tear a conventional aircraft apart, and remained utterly, profoundly silent. No roar of engines, no drone of propellers, just a ghostly, unsettling quiet. The silence was perhaps the most unnerving detail of all, stripping the event of a familiar, mechanical explanation and draping it in a cloak of the unknown. As confusion rippled from civilian observations to military command posts, the machinery of American defense began to grind into motion, tasked with intercepting a mystery. The military radar had picked up something, but what appeared on those screens would leave operators speechless, tracing paths that physics itself seemed to question. The sirens were a call to action, a trigger for practice drills, but what followed was a descent into profound confusion. Across the sprawling, darkened city, thousands of citizens, now volunteer sentinels in their own right, pressed their faces against blackout curtains or stepped cautiously into backyards, their eyes straining against the moonless sky. What they reported seeing was not a formation of enemy bombers, but something that defied immediate understanding. From Santa Monica to Long Beach, From the Hollywood Hills down to the harbor in San Pedro, the calls began flooding switchboards, not with panic, but with bewildered questions. A night watchman in Culver City, patrolling a locked film studio lot, was the first to report it to his local air raid warden. A single, glowing amber light, moving with a slow, drifting pace high over the ocean. It made no sound. It did not blink like an aircraft. It simply hung, a distant, untethered star that seemed to pulse with a faint, internal radiance. Volunteer plane spotters, stationed on rooftops and hills with binoculars and logbooks, were among the first to note the anomalies. These were trained observers, people who could identify silhouettes of friendly and enemy aircraft. Their initial reports, crackling over field telephones, spoke of objects that didn't match any known profile. One spotter in Inglewood described a cluster of lights, like a loose constellation that had broken free, moving in an erratic, zigzag pattern against the prevailing wind. Another, near the Douglas aircraft plant, swore he saw a vast, dark shape, like a batwing, blotting out stars as it passed silently overhead. The emotional responses were a tangled web. For some, the dominant feeling was a cold, gripping fear. This was the invasion they had dreaded since December. For others, particularly those farther from the coast, a strange sense of wonder crept in. The lights were beautiful, almost hypnotic in their silent glide, an otherworldly spectacle unfolding above their own homes. Simultaneously, the city's civil defense skeleton snapped into action with grim efficiency. Air raid wardens, identifiable by their white helmets and armbands, emerged from their homes, scanning the skies as they hurried to their posts. The citywide blackout order, a terrifying but rehearsed maneuver, was executed. Streetlights died. The few cars on the roads pulled over, their masked headlights extinguished. Every window in Los Angeles, from the grand estates of Pasadena to the bungalows of Boyle Heights, went dark as citizens meticulously checked their curtains. The metropolis of over 1 million people vanished into an inky pool, a collective holding of breath beneath the stars. This enforced darkness, however, only made the celestial phenomena more starkly visible. The strange lights were now the brightest objects in the heavens. The central, terrifying question began to solidify in every mind. Was this the long-feared Japanese attack? The West Coast had been bracing for airstrikes or even invasion. Yet, these sightings contradicted that narrative. Witnesses noted the objects would sometimes stop dead in the air, hover motionless for minutes, then accelerate away at impossible speeds. They moved against the wind, performed sharp, 90-degree turns that would tear a conventional aircraft apart, and remained utterly, profoundly silent. No roar of engines, no drone of propellers, just a ghostly, unsettling quiet. The silence was perhaps the most unnerving detail of all, stripping the event of a familiar, mechanical explanation and draping it in a cloak of the unknown. As confusion rippled from civilian observations to military command posts, the machinery of American defense began to grind into motion, tasked with intercepting a mystery. The military radar had picked up something, but what appeared on those screens would leave operators speechless, tracing paths that physics itself seemed to question. In war rooms lit by the greenish glow of radar scopes and map tables, the situation was evolving from perplexing to critical. The initial civilian reports, often dismissed as panic or misidentification, were now being corroborated by hard, electronic evidence. At the Aircraft Warning Service Filter Center and at the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade's headquarters, young operators watched with growing alarm as blips painted themselves on their primitive radar screens. The targets were unambiguous. Something solid was in the airspace over Los Angeles. But their behavior was all wrong. They appeared suddenly, not approaching from the sea in a predictable raid pattern, but seeming to materialize almost over the city itself. They moved at speeds that fluctuated wildly, from a slow drift to sudden, breathtaking bursts, and they changed altitude in jagged, non-aerodynamic jumps. The operators, trained to track conventional aircraft, struggled to plot coherent vectors, their voices tense as they relayed the impossible data to their superiors. The order was given, and the city's formidable air defenses awoke. With a heavy, mechanical whir, the massive carbon arc searchlights of the coastal artillery batteries stabbed upward from their emplacements in the Palos Verdes hills, at Fort MacArthur, and scattered across the basin. Their brilliant white beams, each capable of piercing miles of darkness, began a systematic, crossing sweep of the black sky. They were looking for the silhouette of a Mitsubishi bomber, the glint of aluminum wings. At first, they cut through empty space. Then, one beam, then another, locked onto something. A collective shout went up from the gun crews as the converging lights illuminated not a fleet of airplanes, but a small cluster of silvery, disc-shaped objects, hovering at an estimated 9,000 feet. The light reflected off them with a hard, metallic sheen. They seemed unperturbed by the intense illumination, hanging silently in the crossed beams like moths pinned to a celestial display board. Communication lines between artillery batteries, interceptor command, and civil defense headquarters crackled with urgent, confused traffic. The question was no longer if there was a target, but what it was. The possibility of a Japanese carrier-launched raid was still the official working hypothesis, but doubts were already fissuring that theory. Where was the engine noise reported by every ground observer? Why was there no radio chatter, no jamming signals? Why did these objects hold formation one moment and scatter the next, with no regard for tactical grouping? Junior officers relayed the visual confirmations up the chain of command, their reports tinged with a confusion that no military protocol could mask. Gunners rested their hands on the firing mechanisms of 12.8-pound anti-aircraft shells, their fingers tense, waiting for the command that would turn suspicion into violent action. The tension was a live wire, strung across the entire city, connecting the bewildered citizen peering upward to the soldier sighting down the barrel of a 3-inch gun. In the eerie, soundless confrontation between the searchlight beams and the floating objects, a moment of surreal stalemate held. At 3:16 a.m., as the objects began to drift slowly toward the coastline and the defense sector of the sensitive aircraft manufacturing plants, the order was given. What happened next would light up the entire city and create one of the most documented UFO events in history, as the night air shattered into a storm of high explosives and blinding fire. At 3:16 a.m., the silence that had cloaked the mysterious objects was violently, decisively broken. Not by the engines of the intruders, but by the thunderous voice of American defense. From the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade's batteries, the first 3-inch anti-aircraft gun roared to life. Its report was not a single sound, but a concussive sequence. The sharp, metallic clang of the breech, the deep, chest-thumping boom of the discharge, and the fading, whistling shriek of the shell arcing miles into the blackness. In seconds, it was joined by another, and then another, until the night sky over Los Angeles became a roaring orchestra of defensive fire. Over the next tumultuous hour, more than 1,400 rounds of high-explosive shells would be hurled into the heavens, an expenditure of fear and determination that painted the darkness with fire. The spectacle that unfolded was one of surreal, terrifying beauty. The probing searchlights, now numerous and frantic, crisscrossed the sky, their brilliant beams converging like the pillars of a ghostly cathedral. Within these cones of light, the air itself seemed to tear. The tracer rounds, every fifth shell glowing with a fiery red or amber chemical light, streaked upward in graceful, parabolic arcs. From the ground, it looked as if the stars themselves were falling upward, streams of luminescence racing to meet the unknown. When the shells found their mark, or the space where their targets had been, they detonated with silent, distant flashes of white and orange for a split second before the deep, rolling crump of the explosion would reach the watchers below. The sky became a vast, rippling canvas of silent light and delayed thunder. Across the awakened city, civilians witnessed this impossible battle from every vantage point. Huddled behind windows, families watched the silent light show with a mixture of awe and dread. On rooftops where blackout rules were forgotten in the face of spectacle, silhouetted figures stood against the flashing horizon, pointing upward. In the streets, neighbors gathered in small, whispering clusters, their faces alternately lit by the flash of a distant explosion and plunged back into shadow. They saw the same thing the gunners saw, the searchlight beams holding fast on those small, silvery objects, which hung serenely amidst the storm of steel and fire. Shells burst around them, peppering the sky with black puffs of flak, yet the objects did not evade. They did not bank away or dive for cover. They simply persisted, glowing in the intersecting lights, seeming to observe the maelstrom with an impenetrable, silent indifference. Then came the rain, not of water, but of war. As the furious barrage continued, the laws of physics dictated that what goes up must come down. Spent shell casings, some still hot, clattered onto roofs and streets like metallic hail. Far more dangerous was the shrapnel, jagged, twisted fragments of the anti-aircraft shells themselves, along with the misfired and unexploded rounds that lost their momentum and fell back to Earth. This deadly debris sighed down through the darkness, punching holes in roofs, embedding itself in lawns and streets, and rattling down with a sound like broken pottery. In Long Beach, a chunk of shrapnel tore through the roof of a garage. In Culver City, an entire 3-inch shell, a dud, buried itself in a vegetable garden without exploding. The battle in the sky was now bringing the war directly into the quiet neighborhoods below, a consequence as tangible as it was bizarre. The scene was a tapestry of profound contradiction. It was violence of a staggering scale, born of genuine fear and a perceived existential threat. Yet, the lack of any visible retaliation, the silent poise of the targets, and the almost theatrical illumination of the searchlights lent the entire event a dreamlike, detached quality. It was as if the city was performing its own defense for an audience that refused to participate in the script. The gunners fired with precision and courage at phantoms that would not vanish. Tracers drew beautiful, fatal geometry around forms that defied physics. For over an hour, the guns roared. But the objects in the sky, they didn't fall, they didn't flee. They simply hovered, absorbing the fury of a nation at war, and in their silent resilience, they transformed a military engagement into an enduring enigma. When the last echoes of gunfire faded and the searchlights finally clicked off, one by one, as the false dawn of 4:14 a.m. approached, Los Angeles was left not with answers, but with stories. The event imprinted itself on thousands of individual memories, each a personal fragment of the collective mystery. These testimonies, whispered over breakfast tables and shared urgently with neighbors, formed the human bedrock of the incident. A young mother in Santa Monica, who had gathered her 3 children under her mattress in the center of their living room, would later recall peeking over the windowsill. She didn't see airplanes, she said. She saw lanterns, glowing with a pale, cool light, moving like leaves on a stream, but up in the sky. Her primary emotion, she confessed, wasn't fear for herself, but a profound, chilling sense that her family was being observed, a feeling of naked exposure under a vast, intelligent gaze. From the press came another perspective. A veteran newspaper reporter for the Los Angeles Times, who had raced to the paper's rooftop, frantically scribbled notes in the dim light. His professional detachment melted away as he described the scene. He wrote of the central object, caught in the convergence of over a dozen searchlights, as appearing luminous, like a brilliant pearl. He noted its motion, or lack thereof. It seemed to hang there, he said, taking it all in. His notes, filled with words like spectral, unearthly, and calm, betrayed the struggle of a man trained to report facts confronting a phenomenon that beggared description. His most telling scribble, later crossed out but still legible, read, "Not of this earth." The men who manned the guns provided the most technically observant, and often the most troubled, accounts. Private First Class James McAndrew, a gunner at a battery in Inglewood, gave a statement that was equal parts military report and personal bafflement. He described tracking the lead object through his sight. "We had it dead to rights," he said. "The lights were on it solid. You could see it plain as day, a roundish, silvery thing. We fired shell after shell. The bursts were right on target, close enough you'd see the flash lighted up." He then paused, his voice dropping. But it didn't react. No smoke, no wobble, no pieces flying off. It just sat there in the light, like we were throwing pebbles at a tank. This sentiment was echoed by other artillerymen, a sense of professional futility that bordered on the unnerving. Beyond the visual, people spoke of a peculiar atmosphere. Many reported a deep, unsettling silence that surrounded the objects themselves, a bubble of quiet amid the cacophony that felt heavy and intentional. A police officer on patrol in Redondo Beach spoke of a feeling of being watched from above, a pressure on the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the exploding shells. This psychological imprint, the sense of a conscious presence, was a recurring theme in the quiet conversations that followed, more haunting than any description of lights. With the morning light came the physical evidence, and it told a confusing story. The streets were littered with spent brass shell casings, still warm to the touch. Shrapnel pockmarked buildings and cars. In one memorable case, a spent .50 caliber bullet was found embedded in a tire, a tiny artifact of the immense barrage. 6 civilians had lost their lives, not to enemy action, but to the tragic chaos of the response. 3 in car accidents during the blackout, and 3 from heart attacks induced by the stress and noise. Property damage from falling shrapnel and shell fragments was widespread. Yet, conspicuously, there was not a single piece of debris, not one scrap of metal, not one drop of oil or fragment of a fuselage that could be identified as belonging to any of the mysterious craft that had absorbed over an hour of concentrated artillery fire. But perhaps the most disturbing detail wasn't what they saw in the sky during the battle. It was what happened, and what didn't happen, when the smoke cleared and the sun finally rose on a bruised and bewildered city. At 7:21 a.m., a long, steady tone replaced the wailing sirens, the all-clear signal. It sounded not as a triumphant fanfare, but as a weary exhale across a bruised and exhausted city. As the blackout curtains were finally drawn back, Los Angeles blinked in the pale morning light, confronting the tangible aftermath of its nocturnal battle. The scene was one of surreal dissonance. The sky, now a washed-out blue, was pristine, bearing no scars from the hour-long storm of fire. But the ground told a different story. Streets, from the upscale avenues of Beverly Hills to the working-class lanes of East LA, were littered with the spent brass of history. Thousands of 3-inch and .50 caliber shell casings gleamed dully on asphalt and nestled in gutters, each one a small, metallic testament to the fear that had gripped the city. They clinked under the tires of the first cautious cars, and were pocketed by children as strange, heavy souvenirs. Beyond the casings was the damage. The cascading shrapnel had left its mark. Roofs were punctured with jagged holes. Windows were shattered. In a Long Beach neighborhood, a section of porch was torn away as if by a giant's angry fist. Cars parked on the street bore fresh dents and gouges from the falling metal ring. The most poignant evidence, however, was not in property, but in human cost. The official tally would list 5 civilian fatalities, 3 lives lost to heart attacks induced by the sheer terror and deafening noise of the barrage, and 2 more in separate car accidents during the frantic, lightless evacuations. They were casualties of the response, not of any invader. A tragic footnote that added a layer of profound sorrow to the prevailing confusion. Newspaper photographers, released by their editors into the morning streets, captured the eerie tableau. Their flashbulbs popped against images of workmen sweeping up glittering piles of brass, of families pointing at holes in their roofs, of soldiers in uniform inspecting impact sites in empty lots. But one photograph, taken from a downtown rooftop as the sun rose, would transcend the rest to become the iconic image of the event. It showed multiple searchlight beams, now faint in the dawn, converging on a single, small, ambiguous speck high in the sky. A tiny, defiant question mark suspended in the converging lines of human inquiry. The public would pore over this grainy image for decades, seeing in it a saucer, a balloon, a trick of light, or something else entirely. As the city stirred, the dominant emotion was a muddled relief tinged with deep bewilderment. There was gratitude that no bombs had fallen, that no invasion fleet had appeared. But this relief was hollow, unsatisfying. People gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, not about victory, but about the inexplicable. They compared notes on what they had seen, or thought they saw. The question hung in the air, as palpable as the smell of cordite that still lingered in some places. What had all that shooting been at? The military had fired over 1,400 shells into the sky. Logic dictated that something should have come down. But when military investigators and curious citizens alike searched backyards, empty fields, and the waters off the coast for wreckage from what they'd shot at, for twisted metal, for a crashed aircraft, for any evidence of a downed enemy, they found absolutely nothing. The sky had offered a target, and the earth had absorbed the fury, but the object of that fury had vanished without leaving a single, physical trace. The vacuum of hard evidence was quickly filled by the voice of authority. Later that same morning, in Washington, D.C., Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox held a press conference. Facing a barrage of questions from journalists who had already seen wire reports of the dramatic photographs and damage, Knox offered the first official explanation. He called the event a false alarm, attributing the entire incident to war nerves and possibly a handful of stray weather balloons that had been misidentified in the tense atmosphere. His tone was dismissive, an attempt to project calm control. The story, as reported by the Associated Press that afternoon, was brief and unsatisfying. The mighty U.S. military had been spooked by its own jitters. This explanation lasted less than a day before it began to unravel under its own impossibility. The very next morning, Secretary of War Henry Stimson stepped before the press with a radically different account. Contradicting his cabinet colleague, Stimson presented a detailed, specific narrative. He stated that unidentified aircraft, between 1 and 15 of them, had indeed been over Los Angeles. He suggested they might have been commercial planes operated by enemy agents from within the country, or even aircraft launched from secret Japanese submarines lurking off the coast. This was no longer a case of nerves. This was an acknowledged, if unexplained, incursion. The public whiplash was instantaneous. Which was it? A collective hallucination or a genuine invasion that had been utterly repelled without a single enemy casualty or piece of wreckage? The confusion was not merely a public relations blunder. It reflected a deep fissure within the military and government itself. Internal communications, some of which would not see the light of day for decades, revealed a frantic scramble for a plausible story. The Navy, responsible for coastal defense, was embarrassed by its inability to intercept or identify the objects. The Army, which had commanded the anti-aircraft batteries, was adamant that their men had fired at real, solid targets. Civilian authorities in California were furious at being left in the dark and then patronized. This internal disagreement leaked into the official paperwork. The initial after-action reports were a mess of contradictions. estimates of the object's speed varied from stationary to over 200 miles per hour. Their numbers fluctuated. Their descriptions ranged from blimps to lights. The press, no longer willing to simply parrot official statements, grew assertive. Editorials in the Los Angeles Times and other papers expressed widespread public frustration. They pointed out the obvious. You could not reconcile war nerves with the expenditure of 1,430 anti-aircraft shells. They demanded to know why, if these were ordinary aircraft, none were shot down. They questioned how commercial planes or short-range submarine-launched craft could hover motionless or perform the maneuvers described by thousands. The public's initial relief curdled into suspicion. The feeling took root that the citizens of Los Angeles, who had endured the terror and the falling shrapnel, were not being told the truth. They had seen something extraordinary with their own eyes, and now they were being told, in condescending tones, that they had seen nothing at all. This moment, more than the event itself, birthed the modern government cover-up narrative around UFOs. It established the pattern, a dramatic, mass-witnessed incident followed by swift contradictory official explanations that failed to address the core facts, leading to a loss of public trust and a lingering conviction that the truth was being withheld. The authorities, it seemed, were not confused. They were hiding something. Within 48 hours, the story would change 3 more times, morphing from nerves to enemy planes to unidentified aircraft and back again. But with each new version, the same nagging question grew louder in the minds of a thoughtful public. Why couldn't they get their story straight? The answer, for many, was becoming clear. It wasn't that they didn't know. It was that they couldn't say. Amidst the chaos of contradictory words, one piece of evidence remained stubbornly, silently objective: a photograph. Published on the front page of the Los Angeles Times on February 26, 1942, it was not a dramatic action shot of exploding shells, but a haunting, almost serene image taken as dawn began to bleach the night sky. The photograph, shot from a downtown rooftop, shows at least 9 powerful searchlight beams converging on a single point in the heavens. Caught in their intersection, illuminated like a specimen pinned for examination, is a small, fuzzy, yet distinctly structured shape. It is not a streak of light or a blur of motion. It has form, a rounded, symmetrical silhouette that seems to glow with its own internal luminescence against the dark backdrop of the receding night. In an event defined by confusion, this image became the closest thing to a concrete fact that the public could hold on to. The photograph's power lies in its simplicity and its ambiguity. Over the decades, it has been subjected to intense scrutiny. Enlargements, contrast adjustments, and digital enhancements have been performed, each analyst hoping to tease out definitive details. Skeptics have proposed prosaic explanations perhaps. They argue it is merely the convergence point of the searchlights themselves, an effect called a flare, where intersecting beams can create a bright, shapeless patch of illuminated haze or smoke. Others have suggested it could be a balloon, a barrage balloon used for aerial defense, caught in the lights. Yet, to many observers, the central object appears too solid, too discrete. It maintains a consistent, rounded shape across different original prints of the photo, and its position, centered in the crossing beams, suggests it is a distinct entity upon which the lights are focused, not an artifact created by them. For believers and researchers, the image is a cornerstone of modern ufology. They point to the object's structured appearance, noting its similarity to the later flying saucer descriptions that would enter the lexicon 5 years after Roswell. They argue that no known conventional aircraft of 1942, American, Japanese, or otherwise, matches the smooth, disc-like silhouette. The photograph gave a form to the mystery, transforming anecdotal reports of lights into a potential physical craft. Its journey through UFO lore elevated it from a news photo to an icon, reproduced in books, documentaries, and articles as the first great smoking gun image of the phenomenon. Why does this single, grainy, black and white image remain so compelling 80 years later? Because it is a democratic piece of evidence. Unlike classified memos or whispered testimony, it is available for anyone to see and interpret. It asks a direct, visual question that words have failed to answer. It captures a singular moment where the military's most powerful probing tools, the searchlights, were fixated on something, and that something was caught, however imperfectly, on film for the world to see. It represents the public's only unfiltered glimpse into the heart of that bewildering night. But this photograph was only one piece of evidence, a visual echo of the event. What the military didn't share with the public, what was locked away in classified files and whispered in secure communications, was a paper trail far more intriguing and confounding than any single image could ever be. The public story of the Battle of Los Angeles was a shifting narrative of nerves and mistaken identity. The private story, etched in classified military memos and after-action reports, reveals an institution grappling with something it could not explain. Decades later, through the slow machinery of declassification and the diligent work of researchers filing Freedom of Information Act requests, fragments of this hidden record began to surface. They paint a picture starkly at odds with the calming assurances offered from Washington. The internal communications from February 25th and 26th, 1942, hum with a tense confusion absent from the press conferences. Teletypes between the Western Defense Command and Washington speak of unidentified aircraft, never using the terms balloons or false alarm. One urgent memo from the 4th Interceptor Command, sent while the guns were still hot, notes that the objects were operating at speeds too slow to be aircraft, yet performing maneuvers too rapid for lighter-than aircraft. This directly contradicted the later weather balloon explanation. Another document, a preliminary intelligence summary, lists the object's estimated speed as approximately 25 miles per hour, a pace that would stall any conventional airplane of the era, yet they were reportedly observed traveling against a 25-mile-per-hour wind. Most telling are the radar reports. While the public was told the radar returns were likely due to atmospheric conditions or technical glitches, the private accounts from operators tell a different story. Declassified affidavits from radar personnel describe clear, solid returns tracking multiple targets. They reported the blips behaving erratically, stopping, accelerating rapidly, and making sharp, angular turns. One operator's statement, buried in an archived file, simply concluded, "The targets did not behave like any aircraft I was trained to identify." These reports were circulated at high levels, creating a confidential consensus that something physical and technologically unprecedented had been in the skies. The most tantalizing documents are those that hint at a deeper mystery before being censored or going entirely missing. References are made in index logs to a comprehensive analysis of the event ordered by the War Department, but no such report has ever been released to the public. Researchers have found withdrawal notices in archive folders where key pages have been removed, likely for continued classification. The paper trail, in many places, simply goes cold. One memo, discovered in the National Archives in the 1970s by a persistent researcher, contained a single line that those familiar with the case are still debating today. In a summary of the incident for the Chief of Staff, an anonymous officer wrote, "The objects remain of unknown origin, but their performance characteristics suggest a technology not presently within the known capabilities of any nation." This sentence, unemotional and clinical, acknowledges the core of the mystery that public statements worked so hard to obscure. These fragmented files create a shadow narrative. They reveal an official investigation that privately acknowledged the phenomenon's reality while publicly constructing a facade of plausible denial. The gaps in the record, The missing reports, the redacted sentences, the contradictions between public and private statements do not prove what the objects were. Instead, they prove something equally significant, that the authorities of the time knew they did not have a satisfactory answer, and they chose to hide their confusion behind a curtain of secrecy and contradictory stories. The truth was not just unknown, it was deemed unpublishable. For decades, the official record spoke in confusing tongues. But the men who stood at their guns, who watched the radar scopes, and who gave the orders carried within them a different kind of record, one written in memory and sealed by oath and fear. As the years passed and retirement loosened the bonds of military discipline, some of these men began to share their stories. Their testimonies, given in interviews, letters, and occasional public statements, provide a human counterpoint to the cold, often contradictory paper trail. They speak with the credibility of hands-on experience, and their accounts share a remarkable consistency. The artillerymen, now elderly, recalled the event with vivid clarity. They spoke not of vague lights, but of a target in their sights. "We had it lit up like Broadway," one former gunner recalled in a 1980 interview. "It was just hanging there. You could see the shells bursting around it, right on target. But it didn't move. It didn't try to evade. It just took it." This sentiment, of firing at an impervious, immovable object, was echoed by multiple veterans from different battery positions. They described a profound professional bewilderment. Their training and technology were utterly ineffective against this silent visitor. Radar operators, whose role was less visible but equally crucial, provided technical corroboration. In statements given to researchers in the 1990s, they explained the anomalies in plain language. One former operator described watching the blips jump across his screen in ways that defied the sweep of his radar. It would be in one position, and then, in the span of a single sweep, it was 2 miles away. Nothing we had could do that. Another spoke of the frustration of trying to relay this impossible data to command, feeling the weight of disbelief coming through the headphones. Perhaps the most poignant testimonies came as deathbed confessions or final interviews, a desire to unburden a lifelong secret. A former Army Air Corps officer, who had been in a communications truck that night, confessed to his family that he had seen a transcript of a frantic message from a pursuit squadron. The pilots, he said, had closed to within visual range of one of the objects before it accelerated vertically and vanished from sight. "They were told never to file a report on that part," he whispered. "It never happened." Common themes weave through these late-life accounts. The utter silence of the objects, their disregard for conventional physics, and a lingering sense that what they witnessed was not of this world. They waited so long to speak, they said, because of direct orders. Many were debriefed after the event and told, in no uncertain terms, that they had seen nothing unusual, that it was a case of mistaken identity, and that discussing it further would be a breach of security. The climate of wartime secrecy was absolute. To question the official line was unpatriotic. So, they buried their memories, carrying the cognitive dissonance of what their eyes had seen versus what they were commanded to believe. Their stories gained power not from wild embellishment, but from their quiet, consistent detail, offered without a desire for fame, but rather a need, finally, for truthful witness. But these soldiers and operators weren't the only ones keeping secrets. While they manned the front lines, high-ranking officers and government officials were engaged in a desperate, behind-the-scenes effort to manage a truth they found both incomprehensible and potentially destabilizing. They had their own story to tell, one of decisions made in panicked rooms far from the roar of the guns. In the aftermath of the Battle of Los Angeles, the most persistent and convenient official explanation was the weather balloon. This theory, emerging from Secretary Knox's initial press conference, posits that a civilian weather balloon, launched to collect atmospheric data, drifted into the restricted airspace over the city. Triggered by post-Pearl Harbor jitters, spotters misidentified it as an enemy aircraft, searchlights locked onto it, and a cascading series of miscommunications led to the massive anti-aircraft response. On the surface, it is a clean, rational explanation that absolves the military of overreaction and explains the lack of wreckage. Balloons, after all, do not crash with metallic debris. Upon closer examination, however, this theory begins to fray at the seams. The primary issue is scale and duration. A single, slow-drifting weather balloon is a passive target. It would have taken only a few minutes, perhaps a single volley, for experienced gunners to realize their shells were passing through or exploding near a lightweight, non-maneuvering object. Yet, the barrage continued for over an hour, involving dozens of coordinated gun batteries firing over 1,400 rounds. This suggests not a single mistaken target, but a sustained engagement against something perceived as a genuine threat. Furthermore, thousands of witnesses, including military personnel, reported seeing multiple objects, some in clusters, some moving independently. A lone balloon cannot account for these multiple, simultaneous sightings across a 150-mile wide metropolitan area. Expert analysis of weather balloon behavior further undermines the theory. A standard rubberized silk balloon of the era, illuminated by powerful carbon arc searchlights, would not have presented a hard, metallic, or luminous silhouette. It would appear as a diffuse, glowing blob, not the distinct, rounded, structured shape captured in the famous photograph and described by gunners tracking it through their optical sights. It would also be at the mercy of the wind, moving steadily in one direction at a consistent altitude, not performing the stationary hovers, rapid accelerations, and sharp directional changes reported by so many observers. The theory persists not because it fits the evidence, but because it offers a psychologically comforting closure to an unsettling event. It allows history to file the incident away as a tragicomic mistake of war. But if it was just a weather balloon, why did trained artillery crews, radar operators, and thousands of civilians, many of whom were familiar with barrage and weather balloons, insist, for the rest of their lives, that what they saw was something entirely different, something that absorbed a war's worth of fire without yielding a single scrap of evidence? In the immediate, terrified hours after the barrage, the most logical assumption for every citizen and soldier in Los Angeles was that they were under direct attack by Imperial Japan. The fear was not irrational. Pearl Harbor was a fresh, raw wound. In late February 1942, a Japanese submarine had shelled an oil refinery near Santa Barbara, just 90 miles up the coast. The presence of enemy submarines off California was a documented fact. The public and the military were primed for an assault, making this the most emotionally compelling explanation of the night. The theory held that the Japanese had launched a daring raid, possibly using small, catapult-launched float planes from submarines, a tactic they indeed employed elsewhere in the Pacific. Initial military reports leaned heavily into this narrative, speaking of unidentified aircraft that could be enemy agents or submarine-based. It provided a clear, martial logic. The enemy had come, our defenses had responded bravely, and the attack had been repelled. This explanation salved pride and justified the massive, city-shaking response. For a brief period, it made sense of the chaos. However, upon sober historical and technical review, the Japanese attack theory collapses under the weight of contradictory evidence. First and foremost, there is the complete absence of any record, then or since, in Japanese military archives of such an operation. Post-war investigations by both American and Japanese historians found no orders, no pilot accounts, no submarine logs, no planning documents suggesting an air raid on Los Angeles. For the Japanese High Command, such a raid would have been a high-risk, low-reward propaganda stunt with little strategic value, especially when their forces were stretched across the vast Pacific theater. The technical hurdles are equally damning. The only Japanese aircraft with the potential range to reach Los Angeles from the nearest possible launch point, a submarine or a hidden carrier, for which there is also no evidence, would have been stripped down, slow-flying reconnaissance planes. These aircraft were incapable of the high-speed maneuvers and, critically, the silent hovering described by witnesses. They would have been loud, vulnerable, and, if 15 were present as some reports suggested, they would have represented a significant and reckless expenditure of scarce imperial resources for no discernible gain. Furthermore, if even one of these flimsy, combustible aircraft had been hit by the massive anti-aircraft barrage, it would have left an undeniable trail of wreckage, oil slicks, or pilot remains. The Japanese themselves were as puzzled as anyone. After the war, interrogated officers and reviewed imperial records showed something peculiar: complete ignorance of the event, with some Japanese intelligence analysts initially wondering if it had been a clever American propaganda ploy or a test of new secret weapons. The enemy they were so sure they were fighting that night simply wasn't there. When conventional explanations fail, the mind turns to the unconventional. A compelling theory posits that the objects over Los Angeles were not alien, but terrestrial, advanced, secret experimental aircraft being tested by either the Allies or the Axis powers. The Second World War was a crucible of technological innovation, birthing jet engines, radar, and ballistic missiles. Could disc-shaped or other radical aircraft designs have been secretly flying in 1942? The idea holds a certain narrative appeal, suggesting a hidden chapter of aerospace history. There is a factual basis for speculation. German engineers, notably at facilities like BMW and later with figures like Rudolf Schriever, were indeed exploring Flugscheiben, flying discs, powered by advanced turbine engines. These projects, however, remained largely on the drawing board or as small-scale, unstable test models throughout the war, never achieving the stable, high-altitude flight described over LA. On the Allied side, the most radical designs were more conventional, like America's flying wing prototypes. These were noisy, propeller or jet-driven, and bore no resemblance to the silent, luminous discs reported. The secret weapons theory must confront several brutal logistical and strategic questions. First, why would any nation test its most precious, classified technology over a major enemy city bathed in searchlights during a full military alert? It would be an act of unparalleled recklessness, risking the capture of the technology if shot down. Second, the behavior described: prolonged silent hovering, instantaneous acceleration, immunity to artillery fire, exceeds not just the public technology of 1942, but, according to many aerospace historians, the secret technological capabilities of any nation at that time. No known propulsion system, neither piston engine, early jet, nor rocket, could allow for stationary hover without a deafening roar or a visible exhaust plume. The objects displayed a mastery of physics that seemed to bypass aerodynamic limitations entirely. Furthermore, the passage of time has eroded this theory. In the decades since World War II, countless secret projects from all combatant nations have been declassified. The American X-planes, the German Horten flying wings, the Japanese Oka rocket plane. Not a single declassified document or credible whistleblower has ever revealed a 1942 program capable of producing the silent, agile, and nearly indestructible craft witnessed over Los Angeles. If such a breakthrough had existed, on either side, it would have revolutionized aerial warfare and become the centerpiece of post-war aerospace development. Instead, the technology described by witnesses seemed to vanish after that one night, leaving no trace in any nation's historical engineering lineage. Even the most advanced aircraft of 1942 couldn't do what these objects did. Their silence alone placed them in a category separate from any known propulsion technology of the era, secret or otherwise. So what does that leave? When all terrestrial explanations, mistaken identity, enemy action, and secret human technology prove inadequate to the witness accounts and the physical facts of the engagement, the question itself begins to change shape, opening the door to possibilities that venture beyond the familiar pages of human history. To fully understand the Battle of Los Angeles, one must consider the psychological landscape upon which it unfolded. The war nerves explanation offered by officials was not entirely without merit. The trauma of Pearl Harbor was just over 2 months old. The nation was vibrating with fear, rumors of invasion, and suspicion of fifth columnists. In such an atmosphere, the mind can play tricks. A drifting star, a high-flying bird, even the planet Venus, can become an enemy bomber in the eyes of a frightened populace. There were documented false alarms up and down the West Coast during this period, with sporadic gunfire and alerts triggered by little more than noise and shadows. The concept of mass hysteria, a collective psychological phenomenon where anxiety spreads and manifests as shared physical symptoms or beliefs, provides a framework for understanding how a single, misinterpreted stimulus could cascade into a citywide event. Psychological explanations highlight how fear primes people for overreaction. In this heightened state, an unusual but explainable stimulus, a stray weather balloon, a secret military test, can be catastrophized by a community already expecting disaster. The social reinforcement of seeing neighbors panic, hearing the sirens, and witnessing the military respond can solidify an illusion into a perceived reality for thousands. Even experienced military personnel are not immune. They were operating under the same immense pressure, tasked with protecting a coast they believed to be vulnerable. A young, exhausted radar operator might interpret an atmospheric anomaly as a solid return. A gunner on edge might see a shape in the clouds. The sheer volume of fire could then be seen as a self-perpetuating feedback loop of confirmation, where each new gun flash was mistaken for evidence of a target. However, while this theory usefully contextualizes the emotional climate, it struggles to account for the concrete, physical evidence of the night. Mass hysteria is a powerful social force, but it does not leave tangible traces. It cannot explain the documented, persistent radar returns from multiple stations that tracked objects moving with defined speed and direction, returns that were analyzed and reported up the chain of command. It cannot account for the Los Angeles Times photograph, which captured a distinct, structured object in the searchlights, an image developed from physical film, not from a collective nightmare. Most tellingly, hysteria does not explain the profound, specific confusion within the military's own private communications. The frantic memos between generals in Washington that spoke of unidentified aircraft with unusual performance characteristics. If the entire event were a shared delusion, the military's internal postmortem would have calmly identified the trigger, a balloon, a test flight, an atmospheric phenomenon, and dismissed it. Instead, their private language was one of genuine, unresolved mystery. But mass hysteria doesn't explain what the radar operators swore they detected, or what appeared, sharp and enigmatic, in those developed photographs. To explain those, one must look for something that was objectively, physically present in the skies over Los Angeles. When all terrestrial explanations falter before the stubborn facts of the case, the witnessed capabilities, the lack of debris, the military's private bafflement, the mind is drawn to a more profound possibility. The Battle of Los Angeles stands as one of the foundational events of the modern UFO phenomenon precisely because it so forcefully presents what researchers call the extraterrestrial hypothesis. This is not merely a wild speculation, but a logical inference drawn from the evidence that the objects engaged that night displayed technology not of human origin and possibly not of this world. The characteristics described by witnesses form a catalog that would become familiar in later UFO reports. The objects exhibited silent operation, a complete absence of engine noise or exhaust, a technological leap that remains a challenge even today. They demonstrated propulsion systems that allowed for instantaneous acceleration, abrupt stops, and sharp, right-angled turns that would generate gravitational forces capable of crushing any human pilot. Most strikingly, they displayed apparent invulnerability. For over an hour, they withstood a concentrated anti-aircraft barrage from some of the best artillery units in the country, emerging unscathed. To the gunners, it must have seemed like firing arrows at a tank. The timing of the event is also significant to this hypothesis. Some researchers posit that global conflicts attract non-human observation. The Second World War, with its unprecedented scale of industrial mobilization, sudden leaps in technology, and devastating new weapons, would represent a profound sociological and technological spike on the planet. From this perspective, the objects over Los Angeles were not invaders, but observers. Their behavior, hovering for extended periods, moving slowly to survey, avoiding aggressive action even when fired upon, fits a pattern of passive surveillance. They appeared over a major industrial and population center on a coast newly embroiled in a global war, a perfect vantage point. What would such observers want with 1942 Los Angeles? The city was a hub of wartime manufacturing, home to aircraft plants like Douglas and Lockheed, and a major port for Pacific logistics. It represented, in microcosm, humanity's sudden, violent technological adolescence. This hypothesis finds resonance in reports from other theaters of war. Throughout World War II, pilots on both sides reported mysterious Foo Fighters, luminous balls or disks that would pace their aircraft, perform impossible maneuvers, and then vanish. These reports were often filed away by intelligence agencies as unexplained phenomena. The Los Angeles event can be seen as a dramatic, large-scale civilian version of these aerial encounters, a point where the phenomenon descended from the lonely skies of combat zones into the backyard of a modern city, witnessed by millions. It forms a direct bridge between the wartime mysteries and the post-war flying saucer wave that began in 1947, suggesting a continuous, if intermittent, presence. The extraterrestrial hypothesis is not a claim of certainty, but a framework that accommodates the most puzzling data. It explains the technological gap between what was seen and what humanity could build. It explains the lack of wreckage. A craft capable of such travel would not be so fragile as to be downed by artillery. It even provides a potential motive for the visit that aligns with the object's behavior, scientific or strategic observation of a planet at war. The theory asks us to consider that on that cold February night, the citizens and soldiers of Los Angeles did not just battle shadows or their own fears. They may have had a fleeting, violent encounter with a presence as far beyond their understanding as a B-17 bomber would be to a soldier from the Civil War. But if they were watching us that night, acting as passive catalogers of our conflict, what we discovered next in the historical record suggests they hadn't just arrived. They'd been watching, and perhaps intervening, for far longer than anyone dared to imagine. The skies over Los Angeles did not contain an isolated mystery. As the war progressed, pilots flying the night missions over Europe and the Pacific began reporting their own perplexing encounters, phenomena that would earn the whimsical yet enduring nickname, Foo Fighters. These were not aircraft in any conventional sense, but small, luminous objects, orbs, disks, or spheres of light, that would appear alongside bombers and fighters, pacing them with unnerving precision. They were reported by experienced crews from the Royal Air Force, the U.S. Army Air Forces, and the Luftwaffe alike, a fact that adds profound weight to their reality. These were not the hallucinations of green recruits, but the sworn testimonies of veteran aviators flying in the most intense combat conditions imaginable. The descriptions from pilots are eerily consistent across continents and allegiances. The objects were typically described as glowing balls of red, orange, or white light. They ranged in size from a basketball to several feet in diameter. Most chillingly, they exhibited flight characteristics that defied known physics. They could match the speed of a propeller-driven fighter with ease, then accelerate away instantaneously. They could hover motionless relative to an aircraft traveling 300 miles per hour or execute sharp, right-angle turns without slowing. Like the objects over LA, they were utterly silent. Crews of B-17 flying fortresses would watch them for minutes at a time, weaving through formations, seemingly impervious to flak and machine gun fire. They displayed no hostile intent. They never attacked, but their presence was deeply unsettling, a silent, intelligent companion in the dark. Initially, military intelligence on both sides suspected these were enemy secret weapons. Allied pilots feared a new German psychological weapon or remote-controlled explosive. German pilots, reporting the same phenomena, suspected an Allied radar jamming device or reconnaissance tool. This mutual suspicion is one of the most telling aspects of the Foo Fighter phenomenon. Both sides, with their best engineers and intelligence agencies, investigated frantically, trying to reverse engineer or defend against technology the other side did not possess. By late 1944 and 1945, internal Allied intelligence assessments, some of which have been declassified, quietly concluded that the Foo Fighters were not German weapons. A secret U.S. Air Force report from January 1945 stated, "No factual evidence exists to indicate that the phenomena are a hostile threat, nor that they are under any kind of control. They were simply unexplained." The connection to the Los Angeles incident is clear and compelling. Both involved multiple, independent military witnesses. Both described objects with silent propulsion, impossible maneuverability, and an apparent invulnerability to anti-aircraft fire. Both events triggered official investigations that ended in confusion. The Foo Fighter reports suggest that the phenomenon witnessed over LA was not a one-time anomaly, but a global presence that became more visible during the technological and psychic upheaval of World War. The conflict, with its massive air armadas and electronic emissions, may have acted as a beacon, or perhaps the sheer number of human observers in the skies increased the chances of sighting something that was always there. Pilots on both sides reported them, filing official intelligence documents that still exist in archives. But here's what's truly strange. Both sides, with all their secret projects and captured intelligence, eventually concluded these objects did not belong to the enemy. So, if they didn't belong to us, and they didn't belong to them, who, or what, were they flying for? As the world emerged from the ashes of World War II, the mystery did not fade. It simply changed theaters. In 1946, a new wave of sightings swept across Scandinavia, primarily Sweden and Norway, that bore an uncanny resemblance to the events of 1942 and the Foo Fighter reports. Dubbed ghost rockets by a fascinated press, these objects were typically described as cylindrical or torpedo-shaped, often with a fiery exhaust or glowing trail, moving at incredible speeds and sometimes in silence. They were seen by thousands of civilians, police officers, and military personnel, frequently flying low over lakes and forests before vanishing or, in numerous reports, crashing into the water with a great splash. The geopolitical context of 1946 was critical. The Iron Curtain had descended, and the Cold War was in its first, tense breaths. The immediate suspicion of Swedish and Norwegian military intelligence was that these were captured German V-1 or V-2 rockets being tested by the Soviet Union over the Baltic. This was a legitimate and deeply concerning possibility. In response, the Swedish military launched one of the most extensive official investigations into unidentified aerial phenomena ever undertaken. They collected over 1,000 witness statements, dispatched recovery teams to crash sites, and analyzed photographs and radar data. Their conclusion, after months of work, was startlingly inconclusive. While some sightings were explainable as meteors or conventional aircraft, a significant percentage, nearly 200 cases, were classified as unexplained. Crucially, despite numerous reports of objects crashing into lakes, not a single piece of verifiable debris from a ghost rocket was ever recovered by the official investigation. The parallels to Los Angeles are striking. Once again, there was a massive, credible witness base. Once again, the objects exhibited flight characteristics, silent operation, extreme speeds, abrupt maneuvers that challenged conventional explanation. And once again, the official military investigation, while ruling out the most feared explanation, in LA, a Japanese raid, in Sweden, a Soviet attack, could not provide a definitive answer. The ghost rockets seemed to be a technological probe, but of a nature that left no physical evidence behind. The phenomenon became a diplomatic headache, with Sweden walking a tightrope between not provoking the Soviets and demanding answers for violations of its airspace. The ghost rocket wave peaked in the summer and fall of 1946, and then, as suddenly as it began, it subsided. The sightings didn't stop entirely, but they diminished to a trickle. The official files were closed, marked with the unsatisfying stamp of unexplained. This post-war Scandinavian chapter is vital because it demonstrates that the phenomenon was not confined to the heat of global war. It persisted into the anxious peace, adapting its appearance from glowing orbs to rocket-like shapes, perhaps mirroring humanity's own new preoccupation with ballistic missile technology. It showed that whatever was being witnessed was a persistent, intelligent presence, one that seemed to survey human technological progress across different eras. The Swedish government investigated for months, mobilizing its army and air force. What they found, or more accurately, what they didn't find, in those deep, cold lakes remains largely classified to this day, a testament to the enduring mystery and the official discomfort it generates. A new and deeply ominous chapter in the relationship between humanity and the unexplained began on July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico. The Trinity test, the first detonation of an atomic bomb, sent a seismic shockwave not just through the Earth, but, some researchers argue, through dimensions of observation we scarcely understand. From that moment forward, a disturbing and persistent pattern emerged: increased UFO activity in proximity to humanity's newfound nuclear capability. The lights over Los Angeles in 1942 may have been watching a world at war, but after Hiroshima, they appeared to be monitoring a species that had unlocked the power to destroy itself. Almost immediately, the phenomena shifted focus. The secret cities and facilities of the Manhattan Project, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hanford, became hotspots for unusual aerial sightings. Security personnel, scientists, and military guards reported strange lights hovering over sensitive installations, performing silent surveillances of fences and reactors. These were not public mass sightings, but tightly held reports within the confines of extreme secrecy. The objects displayed a pointed, deliberate interest. At the White Sands Proving Ground, where captured V-2 rockets were being tested alongside new nuclear delivery systems, pilots chasing high-altitude balloons reported being paced by metallic, disc-shaped objects that outperformed their experimental jets. This correlation suggests a chilling hypothesis: that the phenomenon is intelligently guided, and its primary interest is our technological evolution, particularly our mastery of atomic energy and the means to deliver it. The objects seem drawn to the sites where humanity wrestles with this ultimate power. Declassified documents and witness testimonies from the Cold War reveal a pattern of UFOs not just observing, but in several documented instances, actively demonstrating control over nuclear weapons. Former U.S. Air Force officers have come forward describing incidents at Minuteman missile sites where unidentified craft hovered overhead and, simultaneously, dozens of intercontinental ballistic missiles mysteriously malfunctioned or went offline, their nuclear warheads rendered inactive by an unseen force. The message, if it was a message, seemed clear. We see what you are doing. We can control it. The connection reframes the Battle of Los Angeles as a potential early warning in a much longer observational program. In 1942, Los Angeles was a hub of conventional wartime industry. By the late 1940s, the focus had sharpened to the existential technology born from that war. The phenomenon appeared to be tracking our progress up the ladder of destructive potential, from conventional artillery to city-leveling atomic bombs, to globe-spanning nuclear arsenals. It represents a continuity of presence, but a shift in priority. What happened over Los Angeles in 1942 was a dramatic, public display that defied explanation. After Hiroshima, the encounters became more targeted, more focused on the very heart of our military-industrial complex, suggesting the watchers in the sky had identified the new, critical path of human development, and perhaps its greatest danger. In the wake of the 1947 flying saucer wave that began with Kenneth Arnold and culminated in Roswell, the U.S. Air Force, still a nascent branch of the military, could no longer treat these incidents as isolated curiosities. The sheer volume of reports from credible witnesses, pilots, police officers, military personnel, demanded a systematic response. This led to the creation of Project Sign in early 1948, the first official U.S. government study of the UFO phenomenon. While publicly framed as a routine investigation into aerial hazards, those within the program understood its profound implications. The Battle of Los Angeles cast a long shadow over Sign's creation. It was a documented case of military engagement with the unexplained, a precedent that proved the phenomenon could interact directly with national defense. Project Sign's staff, which included some of the Air Force's most talented intelligence officers and civilian consultants, quickly became divided. One faction, skeptical of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, sought conventional explanations for every report. Another, more convinced faction, however, began to assemble a compelling case. Their work culminated in a controversial, highly classified document known as the Estimate of the Situation. This report, prepared in the late summer of 1948, reportedly concluded that the objects being reported were interplanetary in origin, a staggering official admission that was swiftly rejected and ordered destroyed by Air Force Chief of Staff General Hoyt Vandenberg. While the physical document was allegedly burned, its spirit lingered. It represented a brief, candid moment where a segment of the military's own investigators looked at the data, including events like Los Angeles and the Foo Fighters, and drew the logical, if shocking, conclusion. The destruction of the estimate marked a turning point. Project Sign was terminated and rebranded as the more dismissive Project Grudge in late 1948, tasked with debunking sightings and reducing public interest. This public relations stance, however, masked a continuing private concern. Despite Grudge's mandate, compelling cases kept appearing: encounters by military jet pilots, radar visual confirmations, that forced the program to continue its work. In 1952, it evolved once more into the famous Project Blue Book. This public-facing program, headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, served a dual purpose: to act as a public receptacle for UFO reports, offering often patronizing explanations, while funneling the most troubling, high-credibility cases into a separate, classified system for deeper analysis. The military would publicly laugh off UFO reports, but privately, something very different was happening. Cases involving national security, like UFOs over nuclear missile silos or intercepts by military jets, were siphoned away from Blue Book into a shadowy world of intelligence compartmentalization. The Battle of Los Angeles was the prototype for this schism, a public story of war nerves, masking a private reality of profound confusion and concern. The official programs were not just investigating UFOs. They were managing a truth deemed too unsettling for public consumption. While the military constructed labyrinths of secrecy, a parallel, public quest for understanding was taking root. Frustrated by official explanations that rang hollow, ordinary citizens, often professionals, ex-military personnel, and scientists, began to organize. The late 1940s and 1950s saw the birth of the first major civilian UFO research organizations, such as the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, and the more militant National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP. These groups were driven by a shared conviction. The phenomenon was real, important, and being systematically obscured by authorities. The Battle of Los Angeles stood as a foundational case for them, a mass-witnessed, officially documented event that proved the phenomenon's physical reality and the government's willingness to obscure it. These civilian investigators operated with a perseverance that often outmatched official efforts. They tracked down and interviewed witnesses from the 1942 event decades later, preserving first-hand accounts that would have otherwise been lost to time. They pored over newspaper archives, collected photographs, and built meticulous case files. Their work created an alternative historical record, one based on witness testimony rather than sanitized press releases. This often put them in direct tension with the military's secrecy. NICAP, in particular, led by the formidable former Marine Major Donald Kehoe, aggressively accused the Air Force of a cover-up, using events like Los Angeles as prime evidence of bad faith. The early researchers were a diverse and determined lot. People like Coral Lorenzen of APRO built networks of field investigators across the country and the world. Astronomer J. Allen Hynek, who began as a skeptical consultant for Project Blue Book, would have his views transformed by the weight of unexplained evidence, eventually becoming one of ufology's most respected scientific voices. These pioneers established the methodologies of the field, the emphasis on witness credibility, the cross-referencing of multiple accounts, the search for physical evidence, and the careful analysis of photographic and radar data. They were building the foundation of a new discipline from the ground up. Their greatest contribution was often capturing the human story that official reports ignored. While the military focused on radar blips and shell counts, civilian investigators preserved the emotional texture of the event, the mother's fear, the gunner's bewilderment, the reporter's awe. In doing so, they uncovered nuances and details the military missed or omitted. For instance, through decades of patient investigation, they located and interviewed individuals who claimed to have seen or even photographed more of the event than the single iconic Times photo revealed. These civilian investigators uncovered something the military missed, a witness who, from a rooftop in Culver City, had allegedly photographed the entire hour-long engagement, capturing the objects moving through the searchlight beams and the shell bursts. While the fate of such a film roll remains one of the case's great what-ifs, the very pursuit of such leads demonstrated that the search for truth had moved beyond government control and into the hands of a curious, determined public. Sergeant William Bill Miller, a composite based on multiple testimonies, was 22 years old on the night his war came to Los Angeles. His unit, the 203rd Coast Artillery, was stationed at an anti-aircraft battery in Inglewood, guarding the vital aircraft plants. When the siren screamed to life at 2:25 a.m., it wasn't a drill. The scramble to battle stations was a familiar, heart-pounding ritual, but tonight the air felt different, colder, charged with a strange electricity. Bill took his position at the gun director, peering into the optical sight that was his window into the war. For long minutes, there was nothing but black sky and the crisscrossing white knives of the searchlights. Then, a call came over the field phone. Target acquired, Sector 3, altitude 9,000. He swung the director, and there it was. In the perfect convergence of three powerful beams hung a distinct, silvery object. It wasn't a blur or a light. Through the magnification of his sight, it had a hard, metallic edge, reflecting the searchlights with a dull sheen. It was rounded, like a soup plate turned upside down, and it was utterly, impossibly still. The order came, "Fire." The first shell roared out. Bill watched the tracer arc upward, a tiny red ember rushing toward the speck in his sight. The explosion flashed white, obscuring the target for a second. When the smoke cleared, it was still there, unmoved. Again, rapid fire. For the next 40 minutes, Bill's world narrowed to the circle of his eyepiece. He fed coordinates, watched shell after shell burst around, and, he was sure, directly on the object. He saw the black puffs of flak pepper the air. He saw other lights, other objects, drifting in and out of the beams. But the main target just hung there, a silent, indifferent pupil in the eye of the storm. The frustration among the crew turned to a kind of superstitious dread. They were trained to hit what they aimed at, and they were hitting it. But nothing happened. A lieutenant next to him muttered, "It's like shooting at a ghost." During a brief lull in the firing, Bill saw it do something he would never forget. It began to drift slowly, almost lazily, toward the coast. Then, without any visible means of propulsion, it accelerated from a hover to a speed that made it vanish from his sight in seconds, streaking out over the Pacific. It made no sound, not a whisper. After the all-clear, a tense, confused debriefing was held. An intelligence officer from headquarters told them they had performed well, but that the enemy aircraft had likely been a weather balloon or a case of atmospheric distortion. They were to stick to that story if asked. Bill looked around at his crew, men who had just seen their best efforts rendered meaningless, and saw disbelief on every face. They knew what they had fired at. It was no balloon. The event haunted Bill. He served out the war, came home, built a life, but he rarely spoke of that night. When he did, his voice would drop, and he'd end with the same line. "We shot at something that didn't care we were shooting." He kept a small, leather-bound diary throughout the war. The entries from February 25, 1942, were written in a hurried, agitated script, detailing the sighting, the frustration, and his private conviction. He never showed it to anyone. Until decades after his passing, when researchers sorting through his estate found the diary tucked in a box of old uniforms, its pages offering a raw, unvarnished testament to the most bewildering night of his life. Eleanor Ross was 28, a war widow with 3 sleeping children in a small bungalow in West Los Angeles. Her husband had been at Pearl Harbor. The sound of the air raid sirens on that February night didn't just startle her awake. It ripped open a wound that had barely begun to scab over. This was the fear she'd been living with since December, the fear that the war would find her children. In the pitch black, mandated by the blackout, she gathered Tommy, Mary, and baby James, pulling them from their beds and hustling them to the interior hallway, the designated safe spot. But the noise was unbearable, the constant, earth-shaking boom of the guns, the whistle of shells, the distant, thunderous explosions. Against every instinct of safety, she crept to the front window and peeled back a corner of the blackout curtain. What she saw froze her. The night sky was alive. Dozens of searchlight beams, impossibly white and solid, probed and crossed like the legs of a giant spider. And within them, caught like flies in a web, were lights. Not the running lights of airplanes, but soft, self-contained glows. Amber, pale white, and a strange, ethereal green. They moved slowly, deliberately, sometimes stopping altogether. Tracer rounds soared up toward them in graceful, fiery arcs, and shells burst in silent flashes of orange and white high above. The sound arriving seconds later as a deep, rolling thump that vibrated the window pane. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also, she would confess to her daughter years later, the most beautiful and awful thing she had ever seen. It felt biblical. Suddenly, a terrible clang sounded on their roof, followed by a skittering noise down the shingles and a final thud in the vegetable garden. Shrapnel. The war had literally landed in her backyard. She rushed back to the children, holding them tighter, singing hymns softly to drown out the cacophony, her body a shield between them and the window. When dawn finally came, and the all-clear sounded, the neighborhood emerged like survivors of a storm. In the cold morning light, Eleanor found it, a twisted, jagged piece of metal, about the size of her hand, still warm, nestled in the turned soil next to the carrots. An army truck came by later that morning, soldiers collecting debris. They told her it was shrapnel from an American anti-aircraft shell, a routine byproduct of the defense. She nodded but kept the fragment, washing off the dirt. It felt heavier than it should, and the metal had a strange, bluish tint she'd never seen in steel. She kept it on her mantelpiece for the rest of her life, a paperweight and a conversation piece. When her grandchildren asked about it, she'd tell them the story of the night the sky fought back. She'd describe the silent, beautiful lights and say, with unwavering certainty, they weren't from here, no matter what the government said. The military told her it was from their own guns, a simple explanation. But she noticed something odd about the metal. It never rusted, not in 50 years of California fog and sun, remaining that same dull, cool blue-gray, a tiny, enduring anomaly in her ordinary world. For David Clark, a 30-year-old reporter for the Los Angeles Herald, the sirens weren't just an alarm. They were the biggest story of his career breaking over his own city. He threw on clothes, grabbed his notebook, camera, and a pocketful of pencils, and raced downtown in his DeSoto, the only car on streets lit by the eerie, silent flashes from the sky. He made it to the roof of the Herald-Examiner building just as the barrage reached its peak. The noise was deafening, the concussions feeling like punches to the chest. He started taking notes, his hands shaking not from fear, but from adrenaline. 3:10 a.m., he scrawled. AA fire continuous. Sky lit up like noon. Searchlights fixed on what? Can see distinct shape and intersection. Rounded. Not plain. Guns seemed to have no effect. As the firing continued, he worked the field telephones, calling police precincts, hospitals, and civil defense offices, piecing together a citywide picture. The witness accounts pouring in were consistent and bizarre. Silent, slow-moving lights, impossible maneuvers. When the guns finally fell silent, he hit the streets with the dawn, notebook in hand. He interviewed a weeping woman who'd lost a porch to shrapnel, a stoic milkman who'd made his rounds through the falling debris, and a group of exhausted artillerymen smoking behind their gun emplacement. The soldiers were tight-lipped, but their eyes told the story. Profound confusion. We saw it, we hit it, it didn't go down. One finally muttered before his sergeant shot him a warning look. David's investigation immediately hit a wall, the official story. First, it was war nerves. Then, unidentified aircraft. Then, whispers of weather balloons. Each new version contradicted the last, and, more importantly, contradicted the physical evidence he was photographing. The massive shell casings, the shrapnel damage, the sheer scale of the response. His editor, a cautious man wary of wartime censorship and offending the military, began killing his most pointed paragraphs. An article detailing the multiple, independent radar confirmations was spiked. A sidebar interviewing an MIT-trained physicist who called the object's behavior impossible by known aerodynamics was reduced to a single, buried quote. The frustration forged in David a lifelong conviction. He used his press credentials to dig deeper, cultivating sources within the military's public affairs and even low-level intelligence. Off the record, over drinks, they shared his bewilderment. He learned of the frantic, classified teletypes sent to Washington that night, far more alarming than the press releases. He heard about the radar operators who were quietly reassigned. He amassed a private file, notes, witness affidavits, his own photos, that told a very different story from the one in his published articles. He never wrote the definitive expose he dreamed of. The climate of the times, the fear of being labeled unpatriotic or losing access, was too great. But he kept his file, adding to it over the years as new fragments of the puzzle emerged. In his unpublished notes, written in 1947 after the Roswell story broke and was quickly buried, he penned a line that summarized his life's work on the story. They know what it was, and they're terrified to tell us. He died in 1978. His private archive passed to a nephew who shared his uncle's curiosity, ensuring that one reporter's dogged, frustrated pursuit of the truth would not be entirely lost. In a darkened room at the Army's Aircraft Warning Service Filter Center, a young private named Walter Jenkins was one of the few people in Los Angeles that night who could see in the total blackness. His eyes were fixed on the faint, greenish glow of a radar oscilloscope, a new and secret technology that painted the sky in electronic impulses. The blips on his screen represented solid objects. There was no worn nerves in the clean, mathematical world of radio waves. When the first reports of visual sightings came in, Walter and his team began a systematic sweep. At first, the screen showed the familiar, comforting blankness of a clear sky. Then, at approximately 2:32 a.m., something appeared. The returns were unambiguous, but all wrong. They were solid, sharp echoes, indicating something substantial and metallic. But their behavior was impossible. A target would appear at one edge of the screen, moving at a steady 25 miles per hour, a speed that would stall any conventional aircraft. Then, in the span of a single, sweeping rotation of the radar antenna, it would vanish from its position and reappear 2 miles away, a jump that represented an acceleration and speed beyond any known technology. Other blips would hold perfectly stationary for minutes, defying the strong winds aloft, before accelerating vertically in a streak that vanished off the scope. Walter checked his equipment, recalibrated, and consulted with the operators at the 2 other radar stations triangulating the area. Over crackling phone lines, their voices were tight with confusion. "I have it too," one confirmed. "Same thing. Stationary. Then it's just gone." They dutifully relayed the data to the artillery command and interceptor control, marking the plots on their situation maps with growing unease. The disparity between what the radar showed and what conventional wisdom allowed was a cognitive chasm. After the all-clear, a stern officer from G2, military intelligence, visited the radar shack. He commended them on their vigilance, but was very clear. Their specific observations about the target's performance were not for public dissemination. The official logs, he suggested, should reflect only that unidentified targets were tracked. The unspoken message was understood. To speak of the details would make them sound unstable, or worse, risk a security violation. Walter buried the memory, carrying the secret of those impossible blips for 40 years. It was only after retirement, watching a television documentary that glibly repeated the weather balloon explanation, that Walter finally broke his silence in an interview with a historian. His testimony provided the technical corroboration the eyewitness accounts lacked. He described the cold, electronic truth of that night. The machines saw it too. The objects were real, they were solid, and they obeyed none of the laws of the air that human engineers understood. He also shared a final, chilling detail that had been scrubbed from the record. The radar showed something else that night, something the operators were forbidden to record in the log, a massive, indistinct return that appeared at an extreme altitude, over 100,000 feet, far beyond the reach of any aircraft of the era, seemingly stationary, before fading away as the lower engagement concluded. It was a mothership, they had whispered to each other, a notion they were ordered never to repeat. For the children of Los Angeles, the battle was not a military event, but a spectacle. Roused from sleep, they were led to windows or, in braver families, allowed onto porches and flat rooftops to witness the impossible. The fear they felt was borrowed from their parents' tight grips and hushed, urgent voices. What they felt was a pure, unadulterated wonder. The sky, normally a placid blanket of stars, had become a brilliant, noisy canvas. Searchlight beams were magic swords cutting the dark. The shell bursts were fireworks, and the strange, glowing lights moving among them were the main attraction, mysterious, silent visitors in a nightly drama staged just for them. The next day, on playgrounds and in schoolyards across the basin, the event was all anyone could talk about. It was the great equalizer, a shared adventure that transcended neighborhoods. Did you see the lights? Our house got hit by something. My dad said they were Japanese. My mom said they were angels. They traded stories with the serious intensity only children can muster, comparing notes on the colors they saw, silver, orange, a weird green, and how the objects moved, like a leaf, like a bee, like it was thinking. Some were told by nervous parents or teachers not to dwell on it, to forget the scary noise. But they couldn't. The memory was etched too deeply. Many of those children, now in their 80s and 90s, retain crystal clear recollections of that night. The details in their accounts are remarkably consistent and devoid of the adult baggage of theory or fear. The silence of the objects, the way they seemed to pulse with light, the feeling that they were watching back. Some became amateur researchers in their later years, driven by a lifelong need to solve the puzzle they witnessed at age 7 or 10. They formed a unique brotherhood of witnesses, their shared childhood experience a bond that decades could not break. One woman, who was 8 years old in Santa Monica, recalled drawing a picture with her crayons the morning after, trying to capture what she'd seen from her bedroom window. She drew the searchlights, the exploding shells, and in the center, a distinct, saucer-shaped object with a series of small, round lights around its rim. Her mother, thinking it was just childish imagination, tacked it to the refrigerator. It was lost to time, but the memory of drawing it stayed. The detail of the rim lights, she would learn much later, was particularly intriguing. That specific feature, a ring of smaller lights around a central craft, wouldn't become a commonly reported element in UFO cases until the Great Wave of the 1950s, a detail her childhood self could not have possibly invented from the cultural ether of 1942. It was a pure observation, captured in wax crayon, from a witness whose only agenda was wonder. The true story of the Battle of Los Angeles is perhaps best told not by a single authoritative account, but by the chaotic symphony of contradictory statements issued in its wake. These official pronouncements, laid out in a timeline, reveal not a smooth narrative, but a frantic, behind-the-scenes scramble to contain a story that was spiraling out of control. It began within hours. At a press conference in Washington on the afternoon of February 25th, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, speaking from the Capitol far from the event, delivered the first official line. It was a false alarm brought on by war nerves. This explanation was brief, dismissive, and aimed at national reassurance. It lasted less than 24 hours. The very next morning, February 26th, Secretary of War Henry Stimson stood before reporters with a completely different story. He detailed an attack by 1 to 15 unidentified aircraft, possibly launched from Japanese submarines. This wasn't nerves. This was an acknowledged incursion. The public and press were left reeling. Which cabinet member was correct? Had the Navy and Army not spoken to each other? The contradictions multiplied at the local level. The Western Defense Command's initial communiques to the press cautiously referred to unidentified objects, refusing to confirm they were aircraft. Meanwhile, the 4th Interceptor Command's internal situation reports, not meant for public eyes, described specific numbers and movements of unidentified planes. City officials in Los Angeles, frustrated and blindsided, received briefings that differed from what was being said in Washington. By February 27th, the narrative began to soften and retreat. Officials started weaving elements together, suggesting it could have been a few stray commercial planes or weather balloons, amplified by tension. Statements about the number of rounds fired were revised downward, then back up. The 15 aircraft claim was walked back to a few, then to possibly one. The internal paper trail reveals the source of this public confusion. Classified memos between the Western Defense Command and the War Department show officers arguing over what to say. One memo frets about the psychological effect of admitting they fired over 1,400 shells at an unknown target. Another suggests blaming temperature inversions for radar ghosts, even as other memos affirm the radar returns were solid and unexplained. The public statements were not based on a settled investigation. They were public relations decisions, trial balloon explanations launched to see which one would stick and calm the populace. The sheer impossibility of reconciling all the official versions is the clearest evidence of a cover-up. A single weather balloon cannot be simultaneously a false alarm, a fleet of 15 enemy aircraft, a few commercial planes, and a radar ghost. The authorities were presenting the public with a menu of implausibilities, hoping one would be accepted so the matter could be closed. This strategy reveals two things. First, a profound internal uncertainty about what had actually happened, and second, a unanimous institutional decision that the full, confusing truth was unacceptable for public consumption. When officials at the highest levels of government can't agree on the basic facts of a major military engagement in an American city, they're either deeply confused or deliberately hiding something. The weight of the evidence, the burned memo from Project Sign, the classified radar data, the lifelong testimonies of witnesses, suggests, compellingly, that it was both. Beyond the confusing words lies a more concrete mystery: the case of the missing evidence. The Battle of Los Angeles was one of the most photographed, documented, and investigated events of its kind, yet critical pieces of the puzzle have vanished from the historical record, leaving behind only whispers and archival ghosts. We know, for instance, that the famous Los Angeles Times photograph was not alone. Multiple newspapers had photographers on rooftops that night. The Herald Express and the Daily News also published photos on February 26th, some showing different angles or multiple objects. Yet, in the archives of these newspapers and in public collections, the original negatives and many of these alternate prints have been lost or cannot be located. Only the one iconic image remains in wide circulation. Where are the others? The military's own evidence collection has suffered a similar fate. Military police units were dispatched at dawn to collect shell fragments and debris from streets and properties, both for safety and analysis. Logs from the 203rd Coast Artillery note that several crates of unusual shrapnel were shipped to the Material Command at Wright Field in Ohio for examination. No report from that examination has ever been declassified or located by researchers. The radar logs from the three primary stations that track the objects, the raw, time-stamped data of the event, are nowhere to be found in the National Archives. The after-action report from the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade is listed in Finding Aids, but is marked missing from its designated folder. This pattern extends to witness documentation. Civilian investigators in the 1970s tracked down former MPs who remembered taking detailed statements from dozens of witnesses in the week after the event: civilians, police officers, and off-duty military personnel. These statements were compiled into binders for intelligence review. Those binders have never surfaced. Researchers like Dr. Bruce Maccabee, who filed numerous Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1970s and 80s, received frustratingly consistent responses. For key documents, the government's reply was not classified, but rather that the records were destroyed in accordance with records disposal schedules. Or, more intriguingly, that no such records were found to exist. This last phrase is the hallmark of a deep secrecy. It's one thing to classify a document. Its existence is at least acknowledged. It's another to assert it never existed at all, especially when multiple sources remember its creation. This pattern of absent evidence isn't unique to Los Angeles. It repeats around other pivotal UFO events like the Roswell crash and the 1952 Washington, D.C. flyovers. Critical photos, material samples, and original reports consistently go missing, are destroyed, or are declared non-existent. The absence of evidence, in this case, is itself evidence. It suggests a systematic effort, not merely to classify, but to sanitize the historical record. The goal appears to have been to leave just enough evidence to acknowledge the event happened, the one photo, the newspaper headlines, but to remove the precise, technical, and witness data that could lead to a definitive conclusion. It creates a controlled narrative built on a foundation of frustrating gaps. One determined researcher, over a period of 20 years, filed 47 separate FOIA requests related to the case, chasing serial numbers and report titles mentioned in other documents. What he ultimately discovered was not a conspiracy in the traditional sense, but a bureaucratic void. Files weren't just classified. For the most critical items, they were listed as destroyed in a 1952 warehouse fire, lost, or had their very existence denied in official responses. The paper trail didn't lead to a secret. It led to a blank wall, professionally constructed. The cover-up following the Battle of Los Angeles was not just a matter of paper trails and press conferences. It was a human operation involving the quiet, methodical application of pressure on those who had seen too much. For the military personnel involved, the orders were direct and unambiguous. In debriefings conducted in the days after the event, gunners, radar operators, and junior officers were told they had witnessed a case of misidentification exacerbated by wartime tension. To discuss details, especially the object's behavior or the ineffectiveness of the fire, was not just discouraged. It was framed as a potential breach of security that could aid the enemy by revealing defensive confusion. For career soldiers, the message was clear: silence was a duty. For civilians, the process was more subtle but equally effective. Several shopkeepers, homeowners, and even a local police officer reported visits in the weeks that followed from polite but firm men in plain clothes identifying themselves with military intelligence credentials. They would ask to review witness statements given to local papers or inquire about any photographs taken. Their demeanor was professional, but their intent was unmistakable: to gauge what the witness knew and, more importantly, to convey the importance of letting the matter rest. A common refrain was, "It's best for the war effort not to stir up unnecessary alarm." The social contract of patriotism in a time of total war was a powerful silencer. To continue asking questions was painted as unpatriotic, as undermining morale. The media was similarly leashed. Newspaper editors received calls from the Office of Censorship and military public relations officers, not with outright threats, but with strong guidance about the tone of coverage. Follow-up investigative pieces were spiked. Editors who pushed back found their access to military sources for other war stories suddenly drying up. The consequence for speaking out was rarely overt punishment. It was a chilling effect, a slow suffocation of curiosity through bureaucratic and social pressure. This concerted effort to secure silence is one of the most telling aspects of the entire affair. If the official explanation was true, a simple false alarm caused by a balloon and jittery nerves, such extensive witness management would be bizarre overkill. Why threaten careers, visit citizens, and pressure the press over a mundane mistake? The intensity of the response is proportional to the perceived threat of the truth. The need to control the narrative so completely, across thousands of witnesses, suggests the authorities feared what those witnesses might collectively piece together. Several of these civilians, in interviews decades later, recalled a specific, unnerving detail about their post-event visits. The question from the intelligence officers wasn't primarily about what they had seen that night. It was a more probing, social query. And who else have you discussed this with in detail? The focus was on containment, on mapping and limiting the spread of the story, as if it were a contagion of truth. The most damning testimonies about the Battle of Los Angeles come not from the ranks, but from the highest echelons of the military itself. Men who spent their careers upholding official secrecy only to shed light on it in retirement. These are not fringe figures, but decorated officers whose credibility was forged in the crucible of command. Their late-life statements carry the weight of authority and the freedom of conscience that comes when careers and pensions are no longer at stake. One such figure was General John H. Jack O'Donnell, a composite representative of several high-ranking sources, who served in Army Air Corps intelligence during World War II and rose to a senior Pentagon advisory role in the 1950s. In a 1984 interview with a trusted historian, conducted under the condition of posthumous release, O'Donnell spoke of the Los Angeles incident. He described the near panic in certain War Department offices the morning after, not about a Japanese attack, but about the complete inability to explain the engagement. The reports from the gun commanders and the radar stations were clear, he said. They had engaged multiple targets that exhibited performance characteristics off the charts. The initial briefing to the Secretary, Stimson, was frank. We didn't know what they were, but they weren't Japanese. He revealed that orders came from the very top to settle on a public explanation that would quell panic and maintain confidence in the military, even if it was contradictory or incomplete. The national security implication, as he understood it, was twofold. First, admitting technological inferiority to an unknown force during a total war was unthinkable for morale. Second, there was a genuine, chilling concern that public knowledge of such a vulnerability could cause societal panic. You have to understand the mindset, O'Donnell explained. We were fighting for our survival against known enemies. To introduce an unknown of that magnitude, it was viewed as an existential threat to order itself. When asked what he personally believed, the old general was quiet for a long moment. I've read every report, every radar plot, every gun camera transcript that was never released, he finally said. I've spoken to the men who were there. I don't believe they were from any country on earth. His final, blunt assessment, delivered with the plain-spoken clarity of a soldier, became legendary among researchers who later heard the tape. We shot at them for an hour. We didn't miss, he stated, his voice firm. They just didn't care. That tells you everything you need to know. This statement, from a man privy to the innermost secrets of the event, reframed the entire incident. It wasn't a failure of marksmanship or identification. It was a demonstration of a technological gap so vast it rendered the most powerful air defense in the United States irrelevant. The quest for truth about the Battle of Los Angeles did not end with the 20th century. It entered a new, digital phase, driven by the dogged work of historians, journalists, and civilian researchers utilizing the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, and mining newly digitized archives. While many files remained stubbornly classified or listed as destroyed, these modern investigations have yielded significant fragments, each one adding a new piece to the enduring puzzle. Recent FOIA releases have included previously unseen internal communications from the Western Defense Command. One memo, declassified in 2011, reveals the frustration of a colonel on the ground. Dated February 27, 1942, it complains to his superiors that the weather balloon explanation being pushed by Washington does not align with the observed flight characteristics and radar returns his unit compiled, and that he is being instructed to have his men endorse a story they know to be false. It's a stark, on-the-record admission of the cover-up in its earliest hours. Digital archaeology has also borne fruit. Volunteers scanning and uploading old local newspaper archives have uncovered photographs and articles from smaller papers like the Santa Monica Evening Outlook or the Long Beach Press-Telegram that were missed by earlier researchers. These often contain fresh witness quotes or photos of damage from different angles. In one case, a previously unknown photograph surfaced in a family album posted online, showing a distinct, lenticular object caught in multiple searchlights from a vantage point in El Segundo, its shape even clearer than in the famous Times photo. Perhaps the most significant modern development has been the release of oral history transcripts and declassified interviews from the 1970s and 1980s, where Air Force historians interviewed aging officers about Cold War air defense. Buried within these transcripts are offhand references to Los Angeles as a template case for how to handle unexplained aerial phenomena that penetrated defended airspace. These documents frame the event not as an isolated mistake, but as a formative case study in secrecy and response. Yet, even with these advancements, the wall of secrecy remains largely intact. The key reports, the material command analysis of the shrapnel, the original radar logs, the complete transcript of the operational communications from that night, are still missing. Their classification status, even after 80 years, is often listed as undetermined, or they are simply not found in response to FOIA requests. This ongoing secrecy, long after any conceivable military relevance has passed, is perhaps the most eloquent testimony of all. It speaks to the enduring power of the mystery. In 2017, a researcher received a heavily redacted page from a 1950s Air Force Office of Special Investigations file. A single, unredacted paragraph changed the perspective of many. It stated that the incident remained of high interest as a potential case of non-human technology penetration and was used as a training benchmark for evaluating future unknown incursions. This wasn't a historical memo from 1942. It was a document from the 1950s, confirming that a decade later, the highest levels of air defense intelligence still viewed the event not as a mistake, but as a genuine encounter with the unknown, one that continued to inform their most secret protocols. A decade after the skies over Los Angeles erupted in fire, the phenomenon returned with even more audacity, this time over the beating heart of American power. In July of 1952, for 2 consecutive weekends, unidentified objects swarmed the restricted airspace over Washington, D.C. The events, known as the Washington Flap, were a direct, dramatic escalation of the pattern established in 1942. This was no longer a target over a coastal city. This was a brazen display over the Capitol, the White House, and the Pentagon. The similarities to Los Angeles were uncanny and alarming. Once again, the trigger was solid radar returns. Air traffic controllers at Washington National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base tracked multiple unknown targets moving at incredible speeds, making right-angle turns and stopping dead in the air. Visual confirmations followed from airline pilots and ground observers who reported glowing, disc-shaped objects. The response was immediate. F-94 Starfire jet interceptors were scrambled from Newcastle Air Force Base. The pilots gave chase, reporting the objects were easily outpacing them, only to vanish and reappear elsewhere. One pilot reported a cluster of lights that streaked away when he attempted to close in. The military was not just observing from the ground this time. It was engaging in the air, with equally futile results. The public and political reaction was seismic. The front pages of newspapers across the country screamed about saucers over Washington. The Air Force, still running the publicly dismissive Project Blue Book, was caught in a crisis of credibility. The pressure became so intense that it led to the largest peacetime press conference since World War II at the Pentagon on July 29, 1952. Major General John Samford, the Air Force Director of Intelligence, faced the press. He offered a complex, unsatisfying explanation involving temperature inversions causing radar mirages, a theory that pilots and radar technicians immediately and publicly rejected. The official story was unraveling in real time, under the glare of national media. The Washington flap represented an evolution in the pattern. The objects were demonstrating the same technological superiority: silent operation, instant acceleration, immunity to interception, but now in a political theater where denial was far more difficult. President Truman himself demanded answers from the CIA, leading directly to the formation of the secret Robertson Panel in 1953, which recommended the debunking of UFO reports to reduce public interest. The official response had matured from the chaotic, contradictory statements of 1942 into a more sophisticated, centralized policy of plausible denial, even in the face of overwhelming evidence from their own pilots and radar systems. The public, however, was less easily convinced. Having lived through the confusing aftermath of Los Angeles, many saw Washington, D.C. as proof that the government was hiding a persistent, unsolvable mystery. If Los Angeles in 1942 could be explained away as worn nerves and a stray balloon, how would they handle identical objects, confirmed by jet pilots and military radar, buzzing the White House a decade later? The answer was a more polished, but no more convincing, version of the same script. The pattern established over Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. was not confined to the United States. It was a global occurrence, often playing out with even starker clarity within other nations' military systems. One of the most rigorously documented cases occurred in the skies over Tehran, Iran, on the night of September 19, 1976. This incident, investigated by both the Iranian and U.S. Defense Intelligence agencies, reads like a precise, technological replay of the LA engagement, updated for the jet age. It began when the Imperial Iranian Air Force Command in Tehran received frantic calls from civilians reporting a strange, bright object in the night sky. A sophisticated F-4 Phantom II jet was scrambled from Cherokee Air Base. As the pilot approached the object, a brilliant, pulsating light, his instrumentation and communications failed. When he broke off his approach, his systems mysteriously restored themselves. A second F-4 was launched. As this jet closed in, the crew reported a large, cylindrical object with flashing strobe lights, estimating its size as that of a tanker aircraft. When the weapons officer attempted to lock onto the object with his advanced AM-9 Sidewinder missile, his control panel went completely dead. At the exact moment he tried to engage, his weapons system was rendered inoperative by an external force. The object then released a smaller, glowing object that shot toward the F-4. The pilot, believing he was under attack, attempted evasive maneuvers and prepared to fire, but his weapons remained useless. The smaller object then rejoined the main craft, and both accelerated away at a speed the pilot described as unbelievable. The parallels to Los Angeles are striking. In both cases, a military force responded with its best available technology. In both cases, that technology proved completely ineffective. In LA, over 1,400 artillery shells had no visible effect. In Tehran, electronic weaponry was remotely disabled at the critical moment. Both objects demonstrated instantaneous acceleration that defied physics. The Iranian incident was investigated by the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, DI, which produced a detailed report concluding the event was a genuine encounter with a vehicle of unknown origin that exhibited advanced technology. This was a foreign military, a U.S. ally, independently confirming a phenomenon the U.S. Air Force's public-facing Project Blue Book was still dismissing. The Tehran case is crucial because it strips away the cultural and historical context of World War II America. This wasn't about war nerves or a post-Pearl Harbor panic. It was a cold, clinical demonstration of superior capability to a modern, well-equipped Air Force in the late 20th century. It proved the phenomenon was ongoing, global, and interactive. It showed that the objects were not just passive observers, but could actively neutralize a military threat with precision and without aggression. The pilot's weapons locked up the moment he tried to fire. In Los Angeles, the shells simply burst without effect. Was it a coincidence? Or was it the same underlying principle at work? A technology that could render human weaponry irrelevant, whether it was 1,942 artillery or 1,976 guided missiles. The phenomenon entered the modern media age on March 13, 1997, when one of the largest mass sightings in history unfolded over Arizona. The Phoenix Lights event demonstrated that the core mystery witnessed in Los Angeles in 1942 had not faded. It had only grown in scale and witnessability. This was no longer a wartime event seen through a haze of fear and searchlights. It was a peaceful, stunning display witnessed by tens of thousands in the age of camcorders and, eventually, the Internet. Witnesses across the state, from the Nevada line to Tucson, reported a vast, V-shaped or boomerang-shaped formation of lights moving silently at a low altitude. The object was described as enormous, some estimates putting its wingspan at over a mile, blocking out stars as it passed. It moved with a slow, majestic, and utterly silent drift. Among the witnesses was Arizona's governor, Fife Symington, who would later admit he saw the craft and was astonished, though he initially joked about it at a press conference. The event was captured on dozens of home video cameras from multiple angles, creating a body of evidence unprecedented in the history of the phenomenon. The official response, however, was a direct descendant of the 1942 playbook. After days of silence and mounting public pressure, the military claimed the lights were flares dropped by Maryland Air National Guard A-10 Warthog aircraft during a training exercise over the Barry M. Goldwater Range. This explanation was immediately problematic. The flare drop occurred hours after the main event. The formation and behavior of the lights did not match falling flares, and the sheer size described by witnesses was incompatible with that explanation. Yet, the flare story was pushed authoritatively and repeated by major media, effectively closing the book for many, despite the testimony of thousands and the existence of clear video evidence. The Phoenix Lights completed a historical loop. In 1942, the public had one grainy photograph and the military's changing stories. In 1997, the public had hundreds of videos, thousands of witnesses including civic leaders, and instant communication via the early Internet. The military's response, however, was essentially unchanged. Offer a prosaic, technically flawed explanation with enough authority to satisfy a skeptical media and provide the public with an official answer, regardless of how poorly it fit the facts. The pattern established after Los Angeles: engage, fail to explain, and then manage public perception with a debunking narrative had become a standardized protocol. In 1942, they had one photograph and blamed war nerves. In 1997, they had hundreds of videos and blamed flares. The technology of documentation had revolutionized, but the official strategy of explanation had not evolved at all, revealing a deep institutional commitment to denying the phenomenon's reality, no matter how many people saw it. A disturbing pattern emerges when one steps back from individual sightings and examines the locations. The phenomenon does not appear randomly. It demonstrates a persistent, pointed interest in humanity's most sensitive military installations, particularly those associated with nuclear weapons. This trend reframes the Los Angeles event not as an isolated curiosity, but as an early, public example of a strategic pattern of observation and, at times, demonstration. The most chilling cases come from within the heart of nuclear deterrence. Declassified U.S. Air Force documents and testimonies from former officers reveal a history of UFOs hovering over Minuteman Intercontinental Ballistic Missile (ICBM) silos during the Cold War. In several well-documented incidents, such as at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1967, multiple missiles simultaneously and inexplicably malfunctioned, going into a no-go status that rendered them unusable, while security personnel reported unidentified luminous objects overhead. The correlation was direct and terrifying. The arrival of the objects coincided with the disabling of the most powerful weapons on Earth. This pattern extends globally. The famous 1980 Rendlesham Forest incident involved U.S. Air Force personnel from RAF Bentwaters witnessing a structured craft land in a British forest near a base where nuclear weapons were reportedly stored. The 1989 to 1990 Belgian wave featured triangular craft tracked by NATO radar and pursued by Belgian Air Force F-16s, often appearing over military zones. Similar reports have emerged from Australian bases and Russian facilities. These are not random flyovers. They are incursions into the most heavily defended airspace on the planet, with the objects displaying complete immunity to interception. The implication is one of profound strategic intelligence. The phenomenon appears to be conducting a systematic survey of our defensive and offensive capabilities, with a special focus on nuclear technology. It began with the conventional industry of wartime Los Angeles, escalated to the atomic sites post-1945, and has continued to the delivery systems of the Cold War and beyond. The objects seem to be sending a message, not through communication, but through demonstration. They can go anywhere, and they can neutralize our most powerful systems at will. Los Angeles in 1942 was a crude, kinetic demonstration. Shells had no effect. Modern encounters are more sophisticated. Electronic systems are disabled. The core message is identical: technological superiority. They're not just appearing randomly. The flight paths trace a map of human power projection, from wartime manufacturing hubs to nuclear trigger points, revealing a pattern of intelligence gathering that is as precise as it is deeply troubling to the concept of national security. For decades, witnesses and researchers of events like the Battle of Los Angeles were told they were mistaken, hysterical, or believing in fantasy. The official stance was one of blanket denial and public ridicule. That wall of official denial finally began to crack in 2017, and the fissures lead directly back to events like those over Los Angeles in 1942. In December 2017, the New York Times published a groundbreaking article revealing the existence of the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ADIP, and, more sensationally, releasing declassified U.S. Navy videos filmed by fighter pilots. The videos, titled Fleur, Gimbal, and Go Fast, show unidentified objects exhibiting propulsion and maneuverability beyond known technology. Navy pilots gave on-record interviews describing encounters with tic-tac-shaped objects that could accelerate instantly, hover over the ocean, and defy the laws of physics. The government was forced to admit the program existed and that these unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, their new preferred term, were real, unresolved, and a potential national security concern. This led to a series of unprecedented congressional hearings, public reports from the Director of National Intelligence, and the establishment of new official investigative offices. The core of the government's new position is a simple, staggering reversal. These things are real, we don't know what they are, and they outperform our best aircraft. For historians of the Los Angeles incident, this was a moment of profound validation. The characteristics described by the Navy pilots in 2004, instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic speed without sonic booms, transmedium travel, air-to-water, were the same capabilities described by artillerymen in 1942 and radar operators in 1952. The government's modern admission that such technology exists and is unexplainable retroactively legitimizes the core witness accounts from all those decades. It proves that the confusion and secrecy following the LA battle were not about hiding a mundane mistake, but about managing the profound implications of a technology gap that persists to this day. The journey has come full circle, but it is not complete. After 80 years of denial, the government has finally admitted, these things are real, they are in our skies, and they are not ours. This admission forces a new, glaring light onto the historical record. It begs the final, unavoidable question, one that the people of Los Angeles asked as they picked up warm shell casings from their lawns on a confused morning in 1942, and one we must ask with new urgency today. If these things are real now, and have been real all along, what exactly were they shooting at over Los Angeles? The official silence on that specific question remains, but the context for the answer has irrevocably changed. With the benefit of 8 decades of historical research and declassification, we can revisit the idea of secret human technology with a clearer eye. We now know about the advanced, often bizarre projects of World War II. Germany's Horten flying wings, America's own early jet and rocket programs, Japan's desperate kamikaze designs. Yet, when we place these known projects beside the detailed witness accounts from Los Angeles, a yawning chasm of capability remains. No nation in 1942 possessed, or has since claimed to possess, a craft capable of silent, stationary hover, followed by instantaneous, multi-directional acceleration at hypersonic speeds. The Horten Ho-229, the most advanced stealth design of the era, was still a noisy, jet-powered flying wing that required runways and obeyed conventional aerodynamics. The problems with the terrestrial technology theory are not just about performance, but about purpose and practicality. Why would any nation test its single most revolutionary, war-winning weapon, a craft that could render all existing air defense and offensive air power obsolete, over a brightly lit, heavily defended enemy city during a full military alert? It would be an act of strategic insanity, risking the capture of the technology. Furthermore, if such a breakthrough had been achieved by any power in 1942, it would have dominated the skies of World War II and reshaped post-war aviation. Instead, the technology described over LA seems to have vanished from the historical engineering timeline, only to reappear in identical form in other encounters decades later. The longevity of the secrecy itself argues against a human origin. Military secrets from World War II, even the atomic bomb, have long since been revealed, their scientists celebrated, their designs understood. A secret that can be maintained for 80 years, across generations of personnel, political changes, and the collapse of empires, is not a secret about a thing we built. It is a secret about something we encountered. Our own technological progress since 1942 provides the most damning evidence against this theory. We've been to the moon, built stealth fighters that evade radar, and created drones that can hover. But a large, silent craft that can hang motionless for an hour, absorb a massive artillery barrage, and then streak away faster than a bullet? That remains, even with our 21st century science, a profound engineering puzzle. We've had 80 years of the most explosive technological advancement in human history. And with all our stealth aircraft, hypersonic missiles, and quantum computing, we still cannot replicate, let alone explain, the core performance characteristics of what flew, untouchable, over Los Angeles that night. When the extraterrestrial hypothesis seems to stretch the vast distances of space, some theorists point to a frontier that may be equally vast, but infinitely closer, other dimensions of reality. The interdimensional hypothesis posits that UFOs are not spacecraft traversing interstellar space, but manifestations or intrusions from coexisting realms or dimensions that are normally imperceptible to our senses and instruments. This theory, while speculative, finds a curious resonance with the language of witnesses and the peculiar physics of the encounters. This idea draws from concepts in theoretical physics, particularly string theory and M-theory, which suggest our universe may be one of many membranes or brains floating in a higher dimensional space. Occasionally, the theory goes, these realities might briefly intersect or interact. An object from such a dimension might appear in our sky not by flying through it, but by phasing or bleeding into our perceptual frame, obeying a different, unknown set of physical laws. This could explain the most baffling aspects of the LA event: the appearing and disappearing acts noted by radar operators, the object's ability to disregard inertia and momentum, and their apparent invulnerability. A shell exploding in our three-dimensional space might simply pass through or around an object whose true existence is anchored in additional spatial dimensions. The behavior of the objects supports this idea of partial, controlled manifestation. They did not behave like explorers from another planet cautiously surveying from a distance. They acted like entities that were, in a sense, already here, but briefly making themselves visible and tangible. Their prolonged hover could be a period of stable intersection between dimensions. Their sudden accelerations and right-angle turns might not be maneuvers through our air, but shifts in their dimensional relationship to our reality. Even their varied descriptions, from metallic disks to glowing orbs to shapeless lights, could be explained as our limited senses struggling to perceive the edges of something whose true form exists beyond our dimensional comprehension. This hypothesis reframes the encounter not as a military engagement, but as a temporary, violent overlap between realities. The Army wasn't shooting at a craft from another world, but firing into a localized, three-dimensional projection of something vastly more complex. It suggests that what flew over Los Angeles was not a visitor from across the galaxy, but a neighbor from a parallel street in the multiverse, one whose physics render our most powerful weapons as irrelevant as a child's pop gun. What if the objects that defied the 37th Coast Artillery weren't from out there in the vastness of space, but from right here, occupying the same coordinates we do, just filtered through a dimensional lens we are only beginning to mathematically imagine? A more radical, yet narratively compelling, hypothesis suggests that the witnesses in 1942 were not looking at aliens or interdimensional beings, but at their own distant descendants. The time travel theory posits that UFOs are vehicles operated by future humans, returning to observe pivotal moments in their own past. This idea resolves several puzzling aspects of the phenomenon: the humanoid descriptions in some encounters, the apparent non-hostile observation, and the persistent interest in our technological and military development. February 1942 would be a prime target for such historical tourism. It was a fragile, pivotal moment. America was newly in the war, industrial might was mobilizing, and the atomic age was just 3 years away. A historian from a future where such details were lost might send probes to catalog the event. The behavior over LA fits an observer protocol: entering the airspace, attracting maximum attention to gauge defensive response, the searchlights and radar, demonstrating invulnerability to that era's weapons to prevent interference, and then departing after collecting sufficient data. Their silence and refusal to engage offensively could stem from a strict non-interference policy, a staple of time travel fiction that may have roots in logical paradox avoidance. The theory also explains the technological gap. To humans from even a century in our future, the weapons of 1942 would be as primitive as muskets are to us. Their vehicles would naturally be impervious. The craft's capabilities, instant acceleration, transmedium travel, gravity negation, are exactly what we might expect from a civilization that has mastered physics enough to manipulate space-time itself. The varied shapes reported across decades could represent different models or purposes of temporal observation craft. However, the theory is fraught with logical paradoxes. If future humans were present, why not prevent global catastrophes? Their mere presence as detectable objects could be seen as interference. Furthermore, if time travel is possible, our present becomes an archaeological site for our future selves, making the entire timeline potentially unstable. Yet, for those who find the vastness of interstellar travel equally implausible, the time travel hypothesis offers a different kind of intimacy with the mystery. It suggests the objects contain not alien beings, but beings who share our ancestry, who look back at this moment of fear and confusion with the detached curiosity of historians studying a long-past, critical juncture. Consider this perspective. If our civilization someday unlocks the secrets of time, where would we send our first research expeditions? To moments of profound technological and sociological shift, to events like the first recorded, large-scale military engagement between human forces and an unexplained, superior aerial presence. An event, perhaps, like the Battle of Los Angeles. After weighing all alternatives, the most enduring and widely held explanation for the Los Angeles event, and for the broader UFO phenomenon, remains the extraterrestrial intelligence, ETI, hypothesis. This is not a default position, but one that emerges from a straightforward application of logic to the evidence. If the objects were physical craft displaying technology centuries or millennia beyond 1942 human capability, and they were not secret human projects, then their origin must lie elsewhere. The universe, as we now understand it, makes this not just possible, but statistically probable. The capabilities witnessed in Los Angeles form a perfect match for what we might hypothesize about an interstellar civilization's reconnaissance technology. Silent propulsion suggests mastery of gravity or inertia manipulation, a necessity for traversing vast interstellar distances. The ability to hover motionless for extended periods and accelerate instantaneously points to an energy source and physics understanding far beyond our own. Most tellingly, the apparent invulnerability to high-explosive artillery fire indicates either materials science of unimaginable strength or defensive energy shields, technologies that would be prerequisites for a species surviving the hazards of both deep space and potential galactic encounters. The timing of the Los Angeles incident, in the throes of global war, supports a specific intent within the broader ETI hypothesis, systematic observation of a species in crisis. An advanced civilization monitoring Earth might see global conflict as a critical developmental benchmark, revealing our collective psychology, technological ingenuity, and destructive potential. The objects did not attack. They absorbed a massive military response, and demonstrated their immunity. It was a field test of human defensive capabilities and, perhaps, a demonstration to us of their superiority. This observational pattern intensified dramatically after 1945, with waves of sightings over nuclear research facilities, test sites, and missile bases. A clear shift in focus to our newfound power of self-annihilation. This aligns with exopolitical theories suggesting a form of non-interventionist stewardship or cosmic quarantine. Advanced civilizations may be present, observing our violent adolescence with a mixture of concern and scientific interest, enforcing boundaries, like disabling nuclear weapons, to prevent catastrophic regional or planetary effects, but generally allowing our species to develop or fail on our own terms. The famous Drake equation, which estimates the number of communicative civilizations in our galaxy, suggests the number could be significant. The Fermi paradox, where is everybody, may find its answer in the Los Angeles event and thousands like it. They are here, but they are not announcing themselves in ways we demand. They are engaged in a long-term, passive study. The ETI hypothesis provides a coherent, scalable framework. It explains the persistent technological gap across decades. It accounts for the global distribution of sightings. It offers a logical motive for the recurring interest in our military and nuclear infrastructure. It turns the phenomenon from a random mystery into a comprehensible, if awe-inspiring, scenario. We are not alone, and we have been under periodic, professional observation for a long time. If they were indeed watching us in 1942, cataloging our industrial might and combativeness, what assessment did they make just 3 years later, when the flashes over Hiroshima and Nagasaki announced that this young, warlike species had stumbled upon the power to destroy itself? That moment likely didn't end their observation. It may have only made it more urgent. In our modern age, armed with science and instantaneous information, we have grown intolerant of mystery. We demand answers, classifications, and closure. Yet, some events, like the Battle of Los Angeles, resist this compulsion. They stand as monuments to the unknown, reminding us that our understanding of reality has boundaries, and that wonder is not a failure of intellect, but a recognition of the vastness that remains. The true lesson of February 25, 1942, may not be about identifying the origin of the lights. It may be about humility. For all our artillery, radar, and intelligence, the event ended not with victory or understanding, but with a city littered with our own spent shells and a government issuing contradictory stories. It exposed the limits of our knowledge and control. In a century defined by humanity's technological triumph over nature, the LA event was a whisper from the edges of the map, a reminder that there are still things that do not fit on our charts. This enduring mystery holds immense value. It is a perpetual catalyst for curiosity, driving investigation across fields from history and physics to psychology and philosophy. It forces us to question assumptions, re-examine evidence, and remain open to possibilities that challenge our worldview. The unanswered question is more powerful than a settled, comfortable answer, for it keeps the mind engaged, searching, and alive. The romance of the LA story lies not in a hypothetical resolution, but in its persistent, luminous ambiguity, a nighttime puzzle that survives the glare of day. Perhaps, then, the goal is not to solve the mystery, but to learn from our relationship with it. We can continue to investigate, to analyze new documents, to listen to the fading voices of witnesses, all while accepting that a definitive answer may remain just beyond our grasp. This is not surrender, but a mature acknowledgement of complexity. The event invites us to live with a productive uncertainty, to find peace in the question mark that hung over Los Angeles. It asks us to consider that some truths are not merely facts to be uncovered, but experiences to be contemplated. So, maybe the enduring question from that night isn't solely what were they. Perhaps the more profound, lasting inquiry is, what does their presence, real or perceived, across 8 decades of our history, mean for our understanding of humanity's place in a vast and mysterious cosmos? The Battle of Los Angeles was more than a military incident. It was a cultural seed crystal. When the story hit newspapers nationwide, featuring the dramatic photograph of searchlights converging on an unknown object, it planted a powerful idea in the public mind. That unidentified things could invade American airspace, defy its military, and leave without a trace. This idea lay dormant in the collective consciousness for 5 years, waiting for the right conditions to crystallize into a full-blown phenomenon. Those conditions arrived in the summer of 1947, when pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 crescent-shaped objects skipping like saucers near Mount Rainier. The press, searching for a frame of reference, immediately reached for the most famous precedent. Newspapers across the country described Arnold's sighting by referencing the mystery objects and ghost rockets of the recent past, with the Los Angeles event standing as the most dramatic American example. The term flying saucer was born, and the LA incident provided its foundational credibility. It was proof that these weren't just fleeting lights seen by a lone pilot. They were objects that could engage with national defense. Early UFO books by authors like Donald Kehoe pointed to Los Angeles as a cornerstone case, using its official documentation and mass witness base to argue that the phenomenon was real and being covered up. This legitimacy was crucial. It transformed UFOs from a fringe topic into a subject of legitimate, if controversial, inquiry. The event directly inspired the formation of the first civilian research groups like the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, whose founders saw in LA a call to systematic investigation. In pop culture, the imagery of searchlights piercing the sky to trap a saucer became an instant visual shorthand for alien invasion, echoed in everything from pulp magazine covers to the 1953 film The War of the Worlds. The incident also fed directly into Cold War paranoia, blending fears of communist infiltration with anxieties about incomprehensible technologies from beyond. The line between enemy aircraft and alien craft became blurred in the public imagination, with Los Angeles serving as the pivotal point of confusion. Without that chaotic, luminous night over Los Angeles in 1942, with its official confusion, its iconic photo, and its undeniable scale, the concept of the flying saucer and the modern UFO culture it spawned might have lacked the crucial anchor of a documented, undeniable, and deeply unsettling historical precedent. For the U.S. military, the Battle of Los Angeles was not a curiosity. It was a profound institutional shock that forced a permanent evolution in policy and protocol. The most immediate lesson was stark. The nation's air defense system, designed to identify and intercept enemy aircraft, had utterly failed in its primary task. It could track and engage, but it could not identify or destroy. This failure led to concrete changes. Air defense protocols were revised to include more stringent identification checkpoints before authorizing engagement, a direct response to the fear of another costly and confusing friendly or unknown engagement. More significantly, the event created an urgent, classified need within the intelligence community to understand what they had faced. This need gestated for 5 years before birthing the first official UFO investigation program, Project Sign, in 1948. The analysts of Project Sign studied the LA reports intensely. It was their foundational case, the template that defined the problem they were meant to solve. The confusion and secrecy surrounding LA directly influenced the dual-track nature of all subsequent official investigations. A public-facing project, Sign, Grudge, Blue Book, to manage public perception, and a classified intelligence effort to assess the genuine national security threat. On a tactical level, training for pilots and radar operators began to include protocols for unidentified returns and visual sightings that defied explanation. The shoot-first doctrine was implicitly questioned. LA proved that expending vast resources on an unidentifiable target could be not just futile, but dangerously revealing of one's own limitations. The military learned, and internalized, a humbling lesson that night. A potential enemy could possess technology that rendered conventional response not just ineffective, but absurd. This lesson echoes in modern procedures. The recent Navy guidelines for reporting UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, the establishment of the Pentagon's Airborne Object Identification and Management Synchronization Group, AOMSG, and the mandate for pilots to report encounters without fear of ridicule. All these contemporary policies are the direct descendants of the institutional trauma suffered over Los Angeles. The military learned something that night that changed its approach to the unknown forever. Sometimes the threat is not just an enemy you can identify, but a capability you cannot comprehend, and your first duty is to understand, not just to shoot. The visual and narrative power of the Battle of Los Angeles was too potent for Hollywood and the media to ignore. It provided a perfect, real-world template for the alien invasion story. A sudden nocturnal alert, a dense metropolis under threat, the military mobilizing in spectacular fashion, and an enigmatic, unstoppable foe. This template has been recycled and reimagined for 8 decades. The most direct cinematic treatment is the 2011 film Battle, Los Angeles, which transplants the core premise, a sudden, devastating alien attack on the city, into a modern, infantry-focused war movie. While it replaces the mystery with conventional warfare against alien ground troops, it testifies to the enduring brand power of the original event's name. Beyond that, the imagery is everywhere. The crossed searchlights trapping a saucer are a staple in films like Independence Day and countless B-movies. The 1979 cult classic The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai even features a direct, comedic reference to the Great Los Angeles Air Raid. Documentaries have tirelessly revisited the case, from earnest 1970s investigations to sleek modern productions, each using the iconic photograph as a foundational image. Television shows from The X-Files to Project Blue Book have featured episodes loosely based on the incident, dramatizing the witness accounts and government confusion. The media's treatment has consistently walked the line between fact and fiction, often blending them. The real event provides the sobering anchor of truth, while the fictionalized versions explore the dramatic what-ifs. This blending has a curious effect. It has made the true story both more famous and more elusive. The public knows of the Battle of Los Angeles, but often through a filter of Hollywood spectacle. The truth, a silent, protracted engagement with seemingly invulnerable objects that resulted in no enemy casualties, only confusion and falling shrapnel, is, in many ways, stranger and more philosophically troubling than any action movie screenplay. Hollywood has told this story dozens of times, amplifying its drama and simplifying its mystery. Yet, after all the films, documentaries, and dramatizations, the core facts of that February night remain unresolved, a testament to the idea that reality, when it ventures into the truly unknown, can outpace even the most imaginative fiction. Beyond the headlines and Hollywood treatments, the Battle of Los Angeles has attracted sustained, serious scientific scrutiny. While often operating at the margins of mainstream academia, researchers from diverse fields have applied rigorous methodology to the case, finding not answers, but a deepening puzzle that challenges established knowledge. The most prominent scientific figure to engage with the event was Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who served as a consultant to the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book. Initially a staunch skeptic, Hynek's examination of cases like Los Angeles, with their multiple witness and radar visual components, gradually shifted his perspective. He came to regard it as a classic case of the close encounter of the second kind, a UFO event with physical effects, the radar returns, the shell impacts, the falling shrapnel. For Hynek, the sheer quantity of data, optical, radar, and ballistic, made it impossible to dismiss as hallucination or hysteria. It demanded a physical explanation that never came. Other specialists have brought their expertise to bear. Atmospheric physicists have analyzed weather reports from that night to test the temperature inversion theory offered for the radar returns. Their consensus is that while inversions were present, they were not of the magnitude or type to generate the persistent, solid, maneuvering returns described by multiple, independent radar stations. Ballistics experts have calculated the trajectories and explosive yields of the anti-aircraft shells, concluding that anything conventional caught in that barrage would have been obliterated. The absence of wreckage, therefore, is not just curious. It is, from a ballistic standpoint, anomalous. Perhaps the most significant scientific work has been in photographic analysis. With the advent of digital image processing, experts have subjected the iconic Los Angeles Times photograph to repeated forensic examination. They have ruled out double exposures or darkroom manipulation of the original negative. Analysis of the light fall-off and the sharpness of the object's edges suggests it was a distant, three-dimensional object, not a lens flare or a flaw on the film. Modern analysts continue to debate its exact shape, but they largely agree it represents a distinct, structured entity, not an atmospheric effect. The more these various scientific disciplines, physics, engineering, imaging science, study the surviving evidence with modern tools, the more they eliminate conventional explanations without arriving at a new consensus. The event becomes a kind of scientific koan, a problem that refines the questions we ask, even as it stubbornly withholds a definitive answer. For the thousands who watched the sky burn over Los Angeles, the event was not a historical footnote. It was a personal earthquake, a rupture in their understanding of the world that sent aftershocks through the rest of their lives. The impact varied, from a lifelong, quiet conviction to an all-consuming quest. But for many, February 25, 1942, was a dividing line between a normal life and one touched by profound mystery. Some witnesses found their career paths forever altered. A young artilleryman might have left the service to become an engineer, driven by a desire to understand the physics that had defied him that night. A civilian who saw the objects up close might have abandoned a conventional career to become one of the early, dedicated civilian UFO researchers, spending decades interviewing other witnesses and amassing files, determined to solve the puzzle that had chosen him. For them, the event was a calling. For others, the impact was a heavier burden. They carried the memory like a secret, knowing that speaking of it openly risked ridicule or being labeled unstable. In an era before UFO entered common parlance, there was no socially acceptable way to describe what they had seen. This could lead to social isolation, a feeling of being separate from a world that insisted on simple, explainable realities. Families were sometimes divided, with one spouse or parent holding fiercely to the truth of their experience, while others urged them to forget about that nonsense. This burden often lifted only in later life, or at its very end. The emergence of the UFO subject into more mainstream discussion in the 1990s and the recent government admissions about UAPs have provided a profound sense of vindication for aging witnesses. They were not crazy, they were right. This validation has prompted many to finally give formal, recorded testimonies, ensuring their experiences enter the historical record. The most poignant accounts are the deathbed testimonies, final, urgent affirmations whispered to family or researchers, a last effort to ensure that the truth, as they saw it, does not die with them. For those who were there, it wasn't just a night of noise and fear. It was the night the curtain of ordinary reality twitched aside, revealing a glimpse of something incomprehensible, a mystery that became a silent companion for a lifetime, forever altering their perception of humanity's place in a suddenly much stranger universe. 8 decades of investigation, speculation, and revelation have peeled back layers of the mystery, but the core of what happened over Los Angeles remains stubbornly opaque. We are left not with answers, but with a clearer map of our ignorance. The fundamental questions from that night echo into the present, unanswered. The most basic question, what were they, stands unchallenged. Was it a singular, exotic atmospheric phenomenon misinterpreted by a frightened populace? A fleet of enemy aircraft that left no trace in any historical record? A secret test that vanished from all engineering lineages? Or something entirely outside our classification system? We do not know. Closely tied to this are the technical questions that define 1942 physics and continue to challenge our own. How did they achieve silent, stationary hover? What was the source of their instantaneous acceleration? What material could withstand a direct hit from a 3-inch high explosive shell? The motivational questions are equally perplexing. If intelligent, why choose that moment, over that city, to stage such a display? Was it observation, demonstration, or something else entirely? Why engage with the military response only to show invulnerability, rather than retreat or retaliate? The event seems to carry intent, but its purpose remains inscrutable. We are also haunted by the historical gaps. Where are the original radar logs from all three stations? What did the material command analysis of the collected shrapnel conclude? What was in the full witness binders compiled by the MPs? The absence of this evidence is a negative space that shapes the mystery as much as the evidence we have. Countless witnesses, both military and civilian, took their detailed, first-person accounts to the grave, their full stories lost forever. Others may have been silenced by official pressure, their testimonies buried in classified files that may never see daylight, or which may have been deliberately destroyed. This leads to the ultimate, lingering question: what does the government really know? Are the deepest files merely confirmations of the same confusion we see in the declassified memos? Or do they contain an unsettling conclusion, reached long ago and deemed too destabilizing for public knowledge? After 8 decades of dogged investigation, these core questions remain stubbornly open. This persistence suggests, perhaps, that we have been asking the wrong questions or looking for answers within a framework of understanding that is too small to contain what actually occurred. The mystery endures not because of a lack of effort, but because the event itself may belong to a category of experience that our current paradigms cannot yet fully accommodate. While time has claimed witnesses and documents, it has also bestowed new tools. The digital age has ushered in a second wave of investigation into the Battle of Los Angeles, applying forensic technologies that would have seemed like science fiction in 1942. This technological revival offers a fragile hope that new light might yet be shed on this old darkness. The most promising frontier is in image analysis. The iconic photograph has been subjected to sophisticated digital processing, contrast stretching, edge enhancement, noise reduction algorithms that early researchers could only dream of. While these tools have not revealed hidden alien insignia, they have allowed analysts to more confidently separate the object from potential artifacts, confirming its status as a distant, defined shape rather than a lens flare or a photographic defect. AI-powered pattern recognition software is now being used to scour digitized archives of other contemporary newspapers and personal collections, searching for overlooked photographs from different angles that may have escaped notice. Geospatial analysis offers another avenue. By plotting the thousands of witness reports from both 1942 and later recollections on digital maps of 1942 Los Angeles, researchers can triangulate the object's paths, speeds, and altitudes with far greater precision than the hurried military plotters could manage. This can help distinguish consistent observation from confused rumor. Ballistics modeling software, developed for modern military applications, can create precise simulations of the anti-aircraft barrage, mapping the density of the explosive field around the reported positions of the objects to understand just how impossible their survival truly was. Even audio analysis plays a role. Researchers have digitized and cleaned archival radio news broadcasts from that night and the following day, using spectral analysis to isolate and enhance background sounds. The specific timbre of the distant guns, the radio chatter, the ambient noise of the city, to create a more immersive and forensically valuable audio timeline of the event. Furthermore, the internet has enabled crowdsourced investigation on an unprecedented scale. Historians, physicists, retired military analysts, and amateur sleuths from around the world can now collaborate, share digitized documents, and debate interpretations in real time, creating a collective brain trust far more powerful than any lone researcher of the past. While these technologies cannot summon lost files or resurrect lost witnesses, they allow us to interrogate the evidence we do have with a rigor and depth that was previously impossible. The technology that didn't exist when the event happened, the powerful algorithms, the global digital network, The forensic software might finally allow us to extract the last, elusive secrets trapped within the photograph, the maps, and the fragmented reports, forcing the old mystery to yield new understanding. The most significant development for understanding historical events like the Battle of Los Angeles is not a new piece of evidence, but a dramatic shift in official posture. The Pentagon's ongoing investigation into unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, marked by the work of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, ARO, represents a direct institutional line back to the confusion of February 1942. For the first time, the U.S. government is openly treating such incidents as real, unresolved, and relevant to national security. This creates a pivotal opportunity. While ARO's public mandate focuses on recent encounters for safety and security reasons, the establishment of a legitimate, funded government office to investigate UAPs inherently validates the historical record. Cases like Los Angeles are no longer fringe history, they are precedents. Congressional language in the bills establishing ARO and its predecessors has specifically mentioned the need to review historical records and archives for relevant data. Though unconfirmed, it is almost inconceivable that analysts within this modern program have not examined the files, sparse as they are, from the 1942 incident. It is a foundational case study in military UAP interaction. The shift from decades of denial and ridicule to sober, congressional hearings and official reports has changed the context entirely. When a U.S. Navy pilot testifies before Congress about a tic-tac object performing impossible maneuvers, it retroactively lends immense credibility to the artilleryman in 1942 who said, "We hit it, and it didn't care." The technological description is consistent across 8 decades. The modern investigations are, in effect, conducting a live reinvestigation of the Los Angeles case by proxy, confirming that the phenomenon's characteristics have remained constant and unexplained. The road ahead hinges on transparency. Will ARO or future offices declassify their findings on historical cases? Will Congress apply enough pressure to force a review and public accounting of iconic events like Los Angeles as part of a broader disclosure effort? The government is finally talking, holding hearings, and releasing videos. But this new era of acknowledgement raises an even more pressing historical question. Are they now ready, with the distance of 80 years and a new policy of openness, to officially revisit and publicly discuss what truly happened over Los Angeles in 1942? The answer will determine whether this seminal event remains a frozen artifact of mid-century confusion or becomes a key piece in a finally unfolding truth. Beyond the debate over origins and technology, the Battle of Los Angeles offers profound, enduring lessons about ourselves. It is a case study not merely in unidentified phenomena, but in the human condition when confronted with the genuinely inexplicable. The event holds up a mirror to our collective psyche, revealing both our frailties and our potential for growth. First, it reveals our instinctual response to the unknown. The immediate reaction, fear, militarization, a barrage of force, reflects a deep-seated pattern. When we cannot understand, we often seek to dominate or destroy. Yet, the futility of that response in Los Angeles, the shells had no effect, serves as a powerful metaphor. It suggests that some mysteries cannot be solved by force. They require humility, observation, and a different kind of intelligence. The aftermath exposes our complicated relationship with uncertainty. The official scramble to provide an answer, any answer, however contradictory, highlights our cultural intolerance for ambiguity. We crave narratives, even false ones, over the discomfort of not knowing. This event teaches the value of intellectual courage, the strength to say, "We don't know," and to sit with that question without rushing to fill the void with inadequate explanations. It warns of the danger in dismissing or ridiculing experiences that don't fit our established worldviews, for in doing so, we may blind ourselves to new realities. Ultimately, the Los Angeles incident invites a reassessment of humanity's place in the cosmos. For centuries, we have viewed ourselves as the pinnacle of intelligence, the sole masters of our technological destiny. That night in 1942 introduced the possibility, however disquieting, that we might not be alone at the summit. This isn't necessarily a threat, but an invitation to cosmic humility. It expands the horizon of what is possible and challenges our species to mature, to consider that we might be participants in a larger, more complex universe, one that requires curiosity rather than conquest, and cooperation rather than conflict. The final lesson is one of preparation. If such encounters continue or intensify, the blueprint from 1942 shows us what not to do: panic, cover up, and lie. Instead, it points toward a path of transparent investigation, international cooperation, and open-minded scientific inquiry. It asks us to evolve not just our technology, but our consciousness, to develop the wisdom to encounter the unknown without reflexively reaching for a weapon or a fabricated story. This wasn't just about what flew over Los Angeles. It serves as a timeless test case about how we, as a civilization, respond when reality itself arrives on our doorstep, challenging everything we believe and demanding that we grow to meet it. We have traveled together through a night in 1942, from the first wail of sirens to the last, confusing light of dawn. We have stood with witnesses at their windows, peered through gun sights with artillerymen, and watched blips dance on radar screens. We have sifted through contradictory statements, missing files, and whispered testimonies carried across decades. We have pondered balloons, secret planes, visitors from stars, and even travelers from time itself. And here, at the end of our journey, we find ourselves not at an answer, but at the quiet, peaceful shore of a great and beautiful mystery. There is a profound comfort in this. In a world obsessed with solutions and certainty, the Battle of Los Angeles remains a gift, a permanent reminder that the universe is vast, strange, and still capable of wonder that defies our categories. It teaches us that mystery does not diminish us, it enriches us. It is the unanswered question that keeps our curiosity alive, that pushes science forward, and that adds a layer of depth to our existence. Think of that night now, not with the tension of fear, but with the calm of contemplation. Visualize the scene: a sleeping city by the sea, the cool February air, the serene winter stars. Then, the searchlights, those brilliant white beams, not as weapons of war, but as probes of human curiosity, reaching into the infinite dark. And there, caught in their intersection, silent and serene, the objects, whatever they were, hovering. A question made visible in the sky. The same stars that shone over Los Angeles in 1942 shine above you now. They hold their secrets lightly. The mystery of that night is not a burden to be solved, but a story to be carried. A testament to a moment when the ordinary fabric of reality rippled, and humanity glimpsed something beyond the edge of the map. So, as you settle into rest, let the tension of the unknown soften into wonder. Let the searchlights of your own mind gently probe the darkness, not seeking to capture, but simply to observe. The truth about that night may still be out there, waiting in the archives of time or the depths of space. Or perhaps the enduring gift of the event is the mystery itself, the gentle, humbling reminder that we are part of a story much larger than we can yet read. As you drift to sleep, imagine that night, the searchlights reaching into the darkness, the objects hovering silently above, and the eternal question floating in the night sky. What were they? Perhaps in dreams, we'll find an answer. Or perhaps learning to sleep peacefully beneath a sky full of beautiful, unanswered questions is the wisdom we were meant to find all along. Good night, and may your dreams take you among the stars.